To her utter astonishment, the GD had agreed to humor her suggestion of discussing the matter in a more formal manner than a confused standoff, replete with cliched responses on a stolen separatist Corvette. Ironically, it had taken Kenobi's cautious, yet well-reasoned backing ever the negotiator, apparently to convince the other council members of the necessity of an in-person meeting. In the temple, no less. They truly were desperate, as they should be. Perhaps there was a sliver of hubris as well, for what would a lone Sith be able to accomplish faced with the whole of the council, of which, it turned out, only about half were present physically and the hundreds of GD on site. They would be in for an unpleasant surprise in case they managed to draw her ire acutely. Of Kenobi and his sidekick on the battlefield, that youngish GD looking like the cover model of a fashion hall mag for melancholic adolescence and all the published propaganda shots of him. Yeah, curious fashion choice for a GD, and so not my type, in case you were wondering, which you probably will. Anyway, if they actually rank among the best the Order has to offer and are thus the celebrated outliers, skill-wise, instead of the norm, well, it doesn't bode well for the GD to begin with. Sidious would not have to put in too much effort into dismantling the whole thing. Exactly. Distract the Masters along with the majority of clones with skirmishes in the Outer Rim, and send in a battalion of well-trained Mandalorians to mop up the rabble on Coruscant. Maybe something along the lines of sabotage to give those too young to put up a fight less messy deaths in their sleep. In their cribs, you mean? What would I do without you spelling out the obvious? I am amazing, aren't I? I really don't know how Theron put up with your antics. Must have been true love or something. Don't you find it hilarious how seamlessly our conversation flowed from slaughtering infants to domestic fluff? I fail to see the humor in any of these things. Back to business, then. Got it. It's only guesswork, but something about Sidious's methods so far tells me that this straightforward scenario lacks his particular flourish. You have to admit, it is a little too lackluster to constitute the ultimate stab in the back of the GD, the final revenge for millennia of humiliation. Fair enough. You're bringing the expertise in being a devious sociopath to the table, so how would you do it, then? Admittedly, I lack insight into their most acute weaknesses, but it would involve shaming the GD in the public's eye, maybe a false flag operation. Something their reputation will recover from, ideally something to set me up as the Republic's true savior instead of them. I don't think Sidious will try to turn many GD in the process. He seems to have little need for acolytes. If he just wants them dead, it has to be a crippling blow, then, something leaving them scrambling to survive from while he picks off the remaining GD. Hard to say, though, what would be the most plausible approach. And the Guard. Would it not be deliciously ironic if the clones turned against their generals, their masters, in a bid for freedom? Just an idea. As for the non-clone officers and fleet, well, without a couple of silencers up my sleeve, it would be best to get them to serve me instead. You know those military types better than I do, but in my experience, if you emphasize security and order, then tend to flock to your side, especially if it's the winning one. Sidious probably isn't as foolish as Thanaton was in his over-reliance on the Force. It would be incredibly wasteful and imprudent to destroy all military capacity. That is assuming he doesn't have a fleet of his own waiting in the unknown regions. Disappointing lack of imagination on your part. I expected something far more sinister and gory. Well, we are here for information. I am sure that'll give me some additional ideas and pointers on how to put them into practice. The Banite Sith have had quite a head start for coming up with something suitably grand, and needlessly elaborate, naturally. I see why you were appointed Draft. You're perfectly suited to vetoing any overly convoluted idea with the lit end of a saber. Should have been present more often at council budget meetings. The majority of the project proposals were a waste of oxygen, at the very least. I feel a pang of pity for Marn. Why only him? I had to attend, too. I wouldn't dare, knowing how much you detest being pitied, and besides, I imagine a good part of those funding requests came from you. The Coruscanti temple felt far more balanced for lack of a more nuanced description, and thus, less nauseating, than the temple on Titan. As Aethers walked along the hallways, probably the first Sith in an exceptionally long time to desecrate this hallowed place, flanked by silent guards in golden armor that made them impossible to tell apart, a faint trace of the dark resonated with her. An echo of the past, or an indication of something running much deeper. What did send pleasant shivers up her spine was her almost nostalgic imagination of what the place must have looked like after the sacking of Coruscant, coupled with pride that her ancestors had been part of the final battle securing that triumph. Seeing the serene busyness of the inhabitants, the gleaming surfaces, the peaceful pattering of the fountains, it was difficult to visualize the hallways strewn with corpses, the building mostly collapsed, parts of the library on fire. History had an unfortunate tendency to repeat itself. Most members of the High Council quietly bristled at the deep, mockingly formal bows she had performed upon entering the chambers. One by one, they warily begun probing her as she stood before them unarmed, smiling aloofly, but pale grey eyes and a face that showed nothing beyond the first signs of aging, typical for humanoids in their late 20s, instead of the utter corruption they'd undoubtedly expected. Even before one of them deigned to speak up, 4GD had already made unsuccessful attempts to slip past her mental shields. Subtly, not by force, but it still defied basic manners and common sense. Aethers' subsequent harsh rebuke had not ingratiated her with them. Then again, little would their hostility permeating the air like the suffocating heat of Tatooine, while she explained her background and intentions. A rather redacted version of both, downplaying her historic role to prevent alienating them from the get-go. To summarize, a regal-looking Toggerton attending via holo, spoke up in a calm and even voice that hardly masked her opposition to the very idea of accepting even her own outline of Xanthrus's explanations as truth. Having grown up Sith during the Cold War period of the after the Treaty of Coruscant, you wound up leading a kind of coalition against another faction backed by the Sith, who was originally the figurehead of the Empire, which he had built up and then ignored in favor of the Eternal Empire. And after your victory, your attempt to stop a weapon of mass destruction about to explode resulted in you spending more than 3,000 years in a kind of stasis, only to be woken by the unwitting locals of the planet having fallen to the Separatists. Some minor inaccuracies on your part. It's complicated, though, so you're excused for that. Xanthrus shrugged apologetically. Look, I did consider coming up with a lie instead, but I like defying expectations a little too much. Ever since she had stepped into the room, the middle-aged male introduced as Mace Windu looked as if he was nursing a dreadful headache, rendering him barely able to look up at her. She was suppressing her presence with the exception of a few occasional glimpses of her actual self, intended to make her audience nervous. Why would it affect him so? His peers appear quite shaken by the revelation as well, but not as if they were about to pass out from agony. I think it is safe to say that this development couldn't be further from expectations. An Nautilin male also present only as a holographic avatar, sighed with a hint of dry weight. So, to give us an understanding of your point of view, Kenobi leaned forward, pensively folding his hands. What is your personal opinion of these new Sith? She did not hesitate to answer their questions. The rule of two? It's absolutely insane, not to mention heretical. However, I hold a modicum of begrudging respect for their apparent ability to keep up a continuous lineage, in secret, too. These Banite Sith appear to be exceptionally patient, if nothing else. In my time, apprentices who did not wish to overthrow their masters at every turn certainly existed, as did masters who collaborated effectively with those serving them, but there was always the option of betrayal from practically everyone around you. Sure keeps you on your toes. Of course, there were laws, customs and rarely, I am afraid, common sense preventing people from random power grabs. Imperial society had to function, after all. Speaking of which, I actually wonder where they are going with all this. Annihilating the GD is a fine goal. There was a sharp intake of breath from several council members. Her lips curved maliciously. So fragile. So afraid. From their perspective, I can somewhat understand the sentiment, given that in my time, the Empire and Republic were at war. Yet, the question remains, and that is one of the biggest issues I have with their approach. What comes after? These Sith are, for all intents and purposes, solitary. Regardless of their manipulations of the Republic, Separatists, and who knows what other organizations their power base consists of, they have no loyal people, no overarching culture backing their ideals. They can only destroy existing structures and erect a tyrannical rule to stay in power. Eventually, the values of society will change, but until then, it's pure oppression. You would have to squat down rebellions regularly and keep spreading fear indiscriminately. It is unlikely to be an effective or even long-lived rule. Is that ill-boding prospect enough to keep them going for millennia, without a particularly power-hungry or, well, pessimistic Darth-fearing from the planet early on? Why wouldn't it suffice? After all, the dark side is the embodiment of destruction and oppression. Windu had apparently found his voice again, although it sounded rather strained. What a narrow view. She scoffed, launching into a furious stream of arguments. Does the universe not strive towards more disorder, increasing entropy with every passing second? Are not the worms in the ground destroying organic matter to feed new growth? Does a volcano eruption not leave behind fertile soil? Don't the most powerful Kyber crystals grow in the harshest conditions? Thus is creation without destruction breeds degeneracy, light without dark is corrupting itself. It's stagnancy, and ultimately, death. What you are describing are natural processes. The dark side represents an entirely unnatural and twisted take on life. It seeks to taint all that 4,000 years, and they're still spouting the very same ridiculous pudu. The GD's suppression of the natural order of things is what's abnormal. Passion is the major driving force. Your ideal is a static world, not a dynamic one. Bad news. That's not how life works, but you are too sheltered to realize this. Xanthrus rolled her eyes and crossed her arms over her chest. I have had dozens of such debates, masters. And yes, those discussions were mostly civil ones, occasionally even featuring tea, believe it or not. Do not exhaust yourself trying to sway my views. Though I am convinced you, in turn, might benefit from an alternative perspective, and open ourselves up to the influence of the dark side. How naive do you presume us to be, that we would willingly invite our own doom? A Zabrak male exclaimed. Once you've realized how logical and empowering this path is, you just can't unsee it. But unless you're weak, at no point are you left without a choice. You truly believe that one can return to the light from a full? The Toggerton inquired. It's not a full, never mind. You're too indoctrinated to understand the subtleties. Tell me, Sith, did you choose that path of yours? Windu asked quietly, yet poignantly, a presumptuous air about him. However much his physical appearance reminded Aethys of her own father, especially the skin tone and lack of hair, his personality couldn't be more different or more unpleasant in general. It was rare for her to take an instant deep disliking to someone she knew next to nothing about, but something about him rubbed her the wrong way. As if he was somehow more of a threat to her than the others. Given the others' deference to him, he seemed to be one of the highest-ranking members of the council, possibly even its leader, though that would not explain the strange vibe she was getting from him, that was almost dark in its fierce determination. Almost, however, still very out of character for a GD. She resisted the temptation to probe his mind back, as he would not take kindly to such an attempt. There were several instances in my life when could have changed my allegiances, if that's what you're asking. I have not yet encountered anything that would compel me to eschew my path thus far. The freedom to choose is a function of power. When you let the Force dominate you, if you are too weak or too passive, of course, the moment you let the dark side take the reins, it will swallow you whole. What you fail to comprehend. The Force obeys me, not the other way around. Unlike you, I do not have to limit myself at all. In fact, what I am doing to conceal my presence right now uses both aspects of the Force. A mere technicality, certainly something stirred in Windu, though he attempted to mask the impact her statement had on him, his stoic expression unreadable. Impossible. Indignant clamoring arose in her audience, the most vocal one being a humanoid with short head tails, protruding from the sides of his large, hardened forehead. The Sith would not be able to draw on the light. Such nonsensical claims, Aethys interrupted them, waving her hand dismissively. Grandmaster Satel Shan understood that the Force is not inherently dualistic. After all, it was she who taught me this technique of her own accord, I should stress. Alongside Darth Maul, of course, but given their unique relationship, that admission would raise even more eyebrows. The ancient-looking greenish GD seated on a cushion to the far right of the room had remained quiet up to that moment. Changed, much as. Time, a great disruptor is. Wisdom of our predecessors, lost may have been. To rediscover, up to us, it is. Learn from her, we can. But not about being GD. About the Sith, yes. To prevail against their machinations, crucial her insight may be. Ears perking up comically, the tiny creature fixated her expectantly, as if to take her measure. If willing to share secrets, you are. Master Yoda, it is precisely her willingness to actually help that is in question. How can we trust anything she says? She might have her own agenda and manipulate us accordingly. An elderly humanoid with a cone-shaped head spoke up. A matter of trust, it is not. Wise as he might be, he sure sounds a little senile. Opposed Sidious, she does. Deception about this, in her I sense not. Lies, entangled in, we are. The shadow of Sidious, darkening the forces. Truth from within, no more can come. As an outsider, even her lies, helpful to stop him might be. With all due respect, the rest of the female Twi'lek's protest was lost due to her hologram's continuous glitching. Ignoring her attempt to speak, Aethys coughed to draw the attention of the council. Ahem, a friendly reminder to everyone that I am present in this very room. To reiterate, I am indeed offering to help you, both with analysis and as a warrior, in the pursuit of vanquishing Sidious and his apprentice. I will not serve you in any form or fight your dishonorable war for you, but everything I know about the Sith is at your disposal. I don't particularly like the idea of such an alliance, though I recognize the necessity, as should you. Joining with what should be my archenemy is distasteful, but more efficient than attempting to find and crush Sidious on my own. Remember, none of this is my criffing problem in the first place. You are not the ancient Republic and, conversely, I owe these Banite Sith nothing. Technically, I could just lean back and wait for him to fulfill his plan, let him become emperor or something, thus revealing himself, and kill him then. But I am quite sure you prefer an earlier intervention and I like a challenge. As to my in fact non-existent agenda. As little as I care about the fate of the Republic, his reign will usher in a development that I cannot allow. That is all. If you're actually not Sidious. I am not convinced yet. Even so, it's still hard to imagine you don't simply intend to use us to draw him out, and then sacrifice us when we serve that purpose. The quality of the Twi'lek Master's Hula connection had improved slightly. Well, she isn't wrong per se. Oh, you have figured me out. A shame. Aethys deadpanned. But wait, wasn't the GD path about service and sacrifice in the first place? Aren't you all eager to become one with the Force? We do not fear death like the Sith, and are able to face it with serenity, since we know that, yes, there is the Force. That is a significant difference to eagerly walking into a blade. Kenobi interjected. Considering your track record, I still have some doubts about that. Her jab lacked the expected hostility. The Twi'lek continued her diatribe despite the banter. We must not forget that she served the Empire, undoubtedly killed GD and Republic citizens without remorse. I hear you talk about ideology. What about actions and responsibility? How can we possibly ally with her, when she has slain our brothers and sisters, as well as those they swore to protect? Aethys was unfazed by the allegations. Well, I am afraid I cannot cite any extenuating circumstances. She is correct as to the death of GD by my hands. Both by my actions and failure to act at key moments, my hands are drenched in blood. However, that is key to my willingness to help you. To make restitution. The Toggerton asked hesitantly, with an equal measure of doubt and hope. No, why would I? Moreover, do not pretend to believe such a thing as redemption is actually possible. You'd rather see me brought to justice if you did not need me. My point is this. In the past, I was unable to go against the traitorous machinations of my master, just as I could not stop the Emperor in time. This time, I am in a position to foil the plan of a megalomaniac of similar caliber, before it comes to fruition. A threat to every single Jedi, she is. A threat to the galaxy, Sidious is. Weigh the horn, we shall. However, protect ourselves, we must. Several councillors nodded in agreement with the elderly creature. It goes without saying that we cannot permit her to roam freely. You're going to put me on a leash. No criffing way. If you truly want to ally with us, you need to understand that we cannot afford to take such a risk. Kenobi tried to defuse the situation. I come here voluntarily, offering to help you prevent the end of the Jedi and the Republic, and you spit on that out of fear. You'd rather sentence trillions to die because of your criffing ideals. Her voice shook with outrage. Windu took the initiative, his tone authoritative. We simply can't allow Sith. You still think you are in a position to allow me anything? Unbridled fury rose in her. Her eyes was beginning to show the effects of the dark side usage immediately. Now you are showing your true self and intentions. Shut up. Her scream knocks over several council chairs, causing the occupants to land on their backs with little dignity. Windu was firmly back on his feet in an instant, saber ignited and pointed towards Aethys's face, eliciting a scornful frown from her. I am going to make my offer one last time. Refuse it, and I will leave you to your impending doom. I will not join forces with Sidious, but of course you can't trust my word. Just know that your hypocrisy will prove your downfall. Decide quickly, or the conversation part is over. You seem to be under the impression that we would let you leave. To underline his point, he shifted into a ready state vaguely mirroring that of Jaya, his face scrounged up in concentration. Ooh, threats, how quaint. Having brought me into the heart of the Order, you seem very sure of your ability to keep me in check. Zathra snarled as she weighed her options. Why don't we find out? Windu's eyes narrowed at the sight of her drawing a cloak of sheer rage around herself. Whereas most Jedi would barricade themselves against the swirl of dark side energies behind their mental shields, to keep up the tight control of their emotions, he was wide open to the Force, almost as if inviting her in. She recognized it for what it was, a trap. But what purpose that approach would serve, she could not say. Haven't seen much from him, but Windu is bloody fast. This might actually be a little tricky, without a weapon. Casting lightning is way too slow to work against this many melee opponents at once. You're getting ahead of yourself, Rap. You just need to electrocute one of them. That brainy-looking one would be my suggestion. Then summon his saber from his smoking corpse, and you're ready to dictate the terms of the battle. I'll keep that in mind in case things go awry. I can't believe I am going to have to talk a Jedi out of a fight, but they are too stupid for their own criffing good. Well, I do love a challenge, that's not what we came for. Don't you dare laugh, this was your plan, too. Despite herself, she took a deep breath, pushing her raging fury back down. It made her feel nauseous, smothering the wellspring of passion instead of sinking deep into it, and letting it broaden her focus. Unless your goal is to prove the peace is a lie, I suggest you switch off your saber. Nice color, by the way. Nox wanted a crystal like that, she could tell from his disproportionate excitement rippling in the background. Windu's eyebrows shot up in bewilderment at her restraint. It is you who attacked us. You would not listen and insulted me. If you feel assaulted because you fell out of your seats, you're even weaker than I imagined. Kenobi rose to stand beside Windu and put his hand on the older man's forearm. Mace, I feel it is my responsibility that she is here in the first place. We have made too many mistakes already, as evidenced by the course of the war. Is this the only way forward? Listen to him. This meeting can end in a bloodbath or an alliance. Your choice to make. Zathras watched her challenger intently. An indecipherable pained expression ghosted over Windu's face before he lowered his blade reluctantly, exhaling shakily. The Jedi equipped with the rebreather mask strode forward, coming to a halt between Zathras and his peers, although still at a safe distance. You explained your motivation sufficiently, though I can only speak for myself in that regard. He glanced around in the room, gauging his fellow councillors' reactions. Thanks for the vote of confidence, I guess. Zathras replied cockily, aware that they had not reached an accord yet. Wise choice, Master Windu. I assume you've warmed up to the idea of me helping you, on my own terms. Don't worry, I won't demand anything outrageous. The gaze of everyone present was on him. After several uneasy seconds, he slowly inclined his head in assent. The three masters still standing warily returned to their seats, while the masked Jedi continued addressing her. Having heard Obi-Wan's account of your actions on Beldarn, I am inclined to believe that you have little in common with the Sith he faced before, for better and worse. What is your hypothesis of how they will carry out their plans? She shrugged dismissively. I don't know how Sidious will realize his goal. However, considering the direction of the war, it is a given that he acts under the assumption that he will achieve it soon. He has no other choice if he wants to keep the momentum going. What I can tell you, though, is this. If he turns the Republic into an empire, he will have to rebuild the society from the ground up. A process so thorough and time-consuming, he will hardly have any opportunity to enjoy his rule before handing the reins over to a successor, a pitiful prospect without extending his life dramatically. Why stop at that? If immortality is an option, his feasibility has been proven in the past. This angle seemed to be one the masters had not considered before, and drew horrified gasps from them. How would this be accomplished? You are aware of Sith sorcery. Mostly blank faces matter, while the greenish master's hairy ears twitched minutely. Fools. Criff, you're so pathetic, it's unbelievable. Calm down, Nox, we're not killing them. Yet. Sidious first. No, not even for the purple saber. I know it matches your lightning, but craft your own, dang it. 2 options come to mind. Spirit transfer into a new body or sustaining oneself through the death of others. He may have found an alternative way, though that's unlikely to be less violent. And are those common abilities among the Sith? Are you capable of such travesties? She turned towards the Nautilus, who had posed the question. Since I draw the line at indiscriminate mass slaughter and genocide, I guess, no. How is it a requirement? Arguably the fastest way to dark side power is by killing, preferably on a large scale. Fuel your rage and hate, hone your skills in constant battle. The galaxy-wide conflict is absolutely perfect. Vitiate fueled the vengeful ambitions of the Sith, and we all played right into his hands, delivering him the continuous carnage he required to grow more powerful. Every single Imperial and Republic death fed his powers. It would be foolish of Sidious to let this rather similar opportunity go to waste, even if the initial idea of instigating the Clone War was to destabilize the Republic. Thus, you lost on all fronts the second you entered this war. She smiled gleefully, slowly making eyes contact with one council member after the other. How ironic, what was that line about merrily walking into a blade? Oh, you are so doomed. You're excited about that prospect. Windu's stern, determined demeanor was back. I am just thrilled to see that the Sith are superior after all, though the way Sidious is going about proving it is questionable. So why not let it run its course? Or even join him? Certainly not. I killed my Emperor for that very thing, the pursuit of immortality that cleaved a bloody line through the galaxy. Do you understand now what you are up against? The realization drew a shudder from some of the attendees, breaking their compass facade. Even disregarding all that, I couldn't possibly leave him unchallenged. Kenobi put a hand on his forehead in exasperation, shielding his eyes, and muttered under his breath Sith logic. Well, I lost everything I knew, can't fault me for being a little bored. She added by way of clarification. The succession among the Sith is ensured through murder. Would you not automatically take up the mantle of Darth if you win? Windu pressed. I already outrank a mere Darth by a good margin, idiot. I got a taste of being Empress when leading my alliance. It's ridiculously tedious. That's not the kind of power I care for. It was so close to the truth that it drew a rather irritated comment from Nox. We should consider ourselves lucky, then. So very lucky. Have I sufficiently assuaged your fears? It's been an eventful week. I am going to retire for tonight. We can assign you quarters, and place me under surveillance. Thanks for the offer, but I pass. I have my own apartment anyway. A very basic and tiny flat devoid of any furniture except for an inbuilt refresher module and a futon she bought after her first night there had consisted of meditation instead of sleeping by necessity. It was situated well above the pauper levels, but still made her barracks on a desk look positively luxurious. Even so, it was vastly superior to having the GD breathe down her neck, though she had little to hide at the moment. They stared after her as she left, making no attempt to stop her. After the meeting, the councillors filed out in complete silence, too shocked by the events to discuss them without prior contemplative meditation. Mace caught up with Obi-Wan as he made his way to the war room, where Isla was supposed to give her briefing, now that they had finally established a stable, secure connection with her for the first time in more than 2 weeks. A moment, please. His voice was but a hoarse whisper, not just by necessity. Obi-Wan turned around, forehead creased with concern upon seeing the state his old friend was in. Are you quite alright, Mace? Mace shook his head as if to clear out a bad memory. It did not seem to have the desired effect. That Sith is a walking, breathing Shatterpoint. I have never seen something like this before. Most have a faded quality to them, as if they are echoes of the past. Others pertain to the present and future, but they are so intangible, the fault lines flickering in and out of existence. He fell silent and sighed shakily. I cannot make sense of it. Is this something she would be able to influence, making herself less readable, for lack of a better word? I would not claim that it's impossible. The Force works in mysterious ways, now more than ever, but it would be unprecedented. She has done something monumental, that much is undeniable. Kenobi conceded diplomatically, stroking his beard. And might still do so. I hope it turns out in our favor. I have my doubts, but I thank you for staying my hand back in the council chambers. Her aura is rather overwhelming. He gently pulled Obi-Wan aside, into a narrower hallway. Seeing as you're the only one who has faced Maul and Tyrannus in addition to witnessing this one's feats on Belderun, what is your impression of her? Like you said, her presence is astonishing when she does not hide it, and the ease with which she does that bodes ill for us. I wonder how we could possibly identify Sidious. I did not mention it while she was present, but she clearly held back when fighting Grievous. She could have defeated him within seconds. I fear she might be far more powerful than she lets on, possibly even surpassing Sidious, as appears to be her assumption. However, it's hard to gauge properly. Her explanation makes sense. Much may have been lost due to the modern Sith's singular focus and method of succession. Thus, Darksiders of her generation likely were a lot more versatile. It does, but I am not quite convinced that it is not primarily her hubris speaking. She may have killed the most powerful adversaries of her time, which does sound rather far-fetched, given how she tried to present herself as generally unremarkable. Yet that is no indication how she would fare against her modern brethren. They had millennia to both recover lost knowledge or to come up with new abominations. Besides, she failed to take into account that they can't have trained only amongst themselves. It would put them at a critical disadvantage compared to the GD order by definition. Valid concerns. Mace, I could have expounded on my assessment during the meeting. Why have you approached me specifically, in private? The reply came after long hesitation. Several of the Shatterpoints have threads linking back to you. How so? Obi-Wan recoiled in surprise. I have no explanation. Such interpersonal fault lines are a common phenomenon, yet I fail to imagine why you of all people and no one else. If it was only because she in effect rescued you from Grievous, well, I would expect a similar connection to Master and Duel. There is none at all. Perhaps I was meant to be killed by Grievous without her interference. We had close encounters in the past. There was more to it, but this was certainly not the time to bring up what had happened on Mandalore. Still, that does not explain the active connections. There would be the remnants of a resolved Shatterpoint, but this, it's unprecedented. I see why you acquiesced, allowing us to ally with her. If only temporarily, I assume. She is far too powerful to remain without observation. If we need to confront her eventually, it should not be in the temple. We are probably playing right into her hands at the moment, yet the alternative would leave us with two factions of Sith fanatically dedicated to eradicating the GD, fighting on two fronts would surely destroy us, if the current front is not sufficient for that. Mace gave him a dejected look. In light of these developments, there is something I must ask of you, Obi-Wan. I know I may be putting you into grave danger, like every time I set foot on a battlefield. The younger master replied with a faint wry smile. Worse than that. If anything, Mace's expression grew more stern. Fulling. You can't possibly be worried about that. You are one of the most committed, most resilient GD, but I fear this assignment could put you into a position that is too exposed. Even for you, I need you to report on her, befriend her even, if such a thing is conceivable. There were few things that could have made this stay even more headache-inducing. Kenobi's holocall had come before the break of dawn, rousing her from a fitful night's sleep. Despite the limited usefulness, she took care to memorize the layout of the hallways he led her through without them, encountering more than a handful of GD, who greeted them, or rather their peer, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. As if he wasn't in the company of their ancient nemesis. They arrived at a nondescript sliding door, and Kenobi cordially ushered her into a bright, functionally furbished room that didn't appear to have seen much use recently. Welcome to my quarters. He gestured around, the oddity of the situation not lost on him, as evidenced by his wary uncertainty. Could I interest you in a cup of freshly brewed tea? With pleasure. Finally someone with manners. Flower or leaf? Kenobi inquired, giving a cautious smile. Leaf, preferably something rich, not one of those grassy blends. In that case, I believe I might have something to suit your taste. He rummaged through several large containers before pulling out a small silken satchel from a wooden box. He gently shook a small measure of the delicate buds into a cloth mesh, which he placed in a small teapot, and added hot water prepared in anticipation of her visit. Carrying the tea set over to a low table, he indicated for his guests to sit down on one of the meditation cushions. Zathras watched him intently as he poured the fragrant tea into two identical cups. His face lit up as she savored the aromatic scent, and then took a tentative sip from the dainty jade green teacup. Ah, perfect. Partially fermented, isn't it? What is this type of tea called? Sapper tea? A flash of wistful sadness marked Kenobi's serene countenance before he summarily squashed it. It was my master's favorite. Her eyes bore into his for several uncomfortable moments before flickering back to her cup. It isn't yours, though. She took another sip. No, however, I always keep a stash of it in remembrance, one could say. I am honored you chose to share it with me of all people. Truly. She swirled the remnants of the bright green liquid around gently, gauging its color, and reached for the jug filled with boiled water to refill the teapot. About 2 minutes for the second infusion at this temperature. That is correct. You appear to be well versed in the intricacies of tea brewing. I find it centering to go through the ceremonial motions, she admitted. Many Sith worlds had their own customs and rituals associated with tea. Herbal tea was typical for my home planet, but I've always associated those blends with their traditional medicinal purposes. Leaf tea or infusions of spices are for enjoyment. Somehow, I wasn't expecting that. Kenobi commented amusedly. Imperial culture was quite refined, actually, a far cry from the savage warrior society you probably envision. Admittedly, I imagine Sith rituals to be rather sinister, and to not typically feature tea. Not everything has to be about bloodshed and feature menacing chanting. Although there are occasions that call for adding blood or bone meal to the brew. results in a nice lustrous call. It does not sound easy on the stomach. Kenobi stroked his beard, an automatic gesture to hide his disgust. Not to mention, revoltingly close to cannibalism. It is cannibalism, I suppose. But it wasn't an everyday practice, don't worry. She refilled her interlocutor's cup with a cheerfulness starkly contrasting the topic discussed. It's a rather visceral way of thoroughly dominating your foe or of drawing strength from another being. Come to think about it, that symbolism is quite ambiguous. Kenobi's usual eloquence seemed to fail him on this bizarre topic. While they drank in silence, Xanthrus's gaze swept over the sparsely decorated room. An array of potted plants on a high shelf held her interest. You enjoyed gardening, another inheritance. He replied almost dismissively, if not for the underlying pain. Such a special relationship. And Maul took him from you. No wonder you hate him so fervently. She purred gently, hypnotically, a sharp-clawed caress on Kenobi's mind, before her demeanor abruptly switched to a brighter mood as she continued. I fear I am not suited for such pastimes. Ah, the plants. Kenobi ventured, taken aback. Xanthrus just nodded in reply, clearly enjoying unbalancing the GD. That not really surprising, though I presume most plants wouldn't thrive in a dark side environment. Not true, unless you regularly treat them with lightning or something. She gave a genuine self-deprecating chuckle. I failed to keep alive Kreffing cacti from Cortland, a dark side desert planet. There surely must be a special achievement for such a feat. Kenobi stifled a laugh, possibly to prevent insulting her. Do you indulge in any, benign leisure activities? You mean, except for murder, mayhem and torturing innocents? She quipped, finger running lasciviously along the rim of the cup. Why bother getting to know me? But if you insist, it was actually a pretty difficult question. I like crafting my own armor from scratch. Guess that doesn't count. Sparring probably doesn't. Neither. I enjoy experimenting with fermented foods. There are other activities I'd rate more highly, but I doubt they suit a GD's delicate sensibilities, such as freaking. She clarified bluntly. Speaking of which, how's that Duchess of yours faring? Kenobi took a few seconds to process the question, his head dizzy from the mental whiplash of the repeated unexpected direction changes of their conversation. I fail to see how that is on topic, he emphasized, but Duchess Satine is well, in large part thanks to your intervention. I have not had the opportunity to express my gratitude, and considering who I am, you now wish you weren't in my debt. Ah, so that is well. He clenched his jaw. In what ways do you expect me to even the score? To think of a few ways, actually. Not in the mood though, this place sure is the opposite of invigorating. You GD are overdoing it a bit with the tranquility. Xanthrus snorted a smug laugh at his scandalized look. No insult intended. I know you're already taken. She's a lucky lady, though, you're easy on the eyes. For a GD, I'll take that as a compliment. A disturbing one, though. Look, you've been rather useful, convincing your GD friends to hear me out. Instantly, the mood shifted as Kenobi's brows shot up, the spark of fear surging through his presence. Is this the part where you run a concealed saber through me, having outlived my usefulness, and proceed to go on a killing spree? Oh? Fatalistic, much. She cleared her throat awkwardly. Did my declaration sound that ominous? Guess I am a little out of practice, then. At any rate, I meant to say, I do not expect any payback from you personally, beyond continuing to keep such an open mind. That minor loophole would have to suffice. Palpable relief went through the GD. That's reassuring, I think, but rather unexpected. I'll be frank, then. What could you possibly have to gain from saving my life twice? It seems quite counterintuitive. Not just your physical life. She peered over the rim of her teacup inquisitively. Do you even realize how close you were? Kenobi met her gaze, confusion etched on his face. On Mandalore. To fulling, as you call it. The Sith added, assessing his reaction. I will admit no such thing. I struggled with emotions in ways I have never before, but I overcame the temptation. His words rang hollow. She hummed noncommittally. Of course, deny it all you want. Even if that were the case, it makes your intervention more puzzling. Oh, Master Kenobi, for being such a smooth talker, you are terrible at lying. I shall give you the benefit of the doubt, though perhaps you've repressed your memories. I could not help but notice that the topic of my actions on Mandalore did not come up at all during the meeting. Am I correct in assuming that you have not told them? Out of shame, perhaps. It's unfortunately rather complicated. It was not an official mission, as you might have noticed. I was not supposed to go there and get the Republic politically involved. His lips twitched with sheepish amusement. I forgot to file a report, as it so happens. No one noticed. Ha, devious. You did not mention it either. Are you intending to blackmail me with the knowledge? I dare say, while my actions would raise a lot of eyebrows, the Council is unlikely to believe a Sith telling them that I was that close to falling. Not that it happened like that at this point. It was quite clear that he glossed over his mistake in order not to give her an actual opening, instead of truly being oblivious to what nearly had come to pass. Stop. Don't try to fool me. It's insulting. I could sense your anger, your burning hatred. It was a wonderful thing, so radiant and focused. You would have actively tapped into the dark side if I had not acted. Obi-Wan let out a pained sigh. Why, though? Would be falling not play into your hands. You were not prepared for it. A fallen GD is a singularly terrible thing. Just a hollowed out vessel for the dark side. That's not what I would want for you. Now that sounds ominous. As if I somehow feature in your plans. He gave an uneasy laugh, as if his worst fears had just been confirmed. I am giving you a choice. Whatever I might have in mind for you, it would be worthless without your agency. You're no use broken. It's probably an affront to you, but you'd make a fine Sith. We would have needed people with such discipline and dedication. The Empire would have been a much better place. And now, the whole galaxy, too. Do you not think it fragmented beyond repair? I appreciate your thoughtful offer, but my answer is a resounding no. I can't think of anything that would change my mind, but you are welcome to try. Besides, I do not see how selflessness, the root of the traits you praised in me, would not go against the Sith philosophy. Your motivation for the pursuit of power matters little in the grand scheme of things. I am sure you've also experienced a situation where many could have been saved, if not for adherence to a deleteriously rigid moral code or stubborn sense of duty. You might have good intentions, but you fall short of achieving lasting success as you lack the will to follow through. That is the greatest folly of the GD, the expectation of making a positive impact when in fact you're forever limited to damage control. How many unnecessary deaths could have been prevented if a GD had not shown mercy to the wrong person? Mercy is a dangerous delusion. Breaking such chains does not mean consummate evil. How many have you killed? Irritated by the interruption, she tapped her fingers against the surface of the table, while she deliberated over her strategy. When she looked back up, she had schooled her face back into a facade of bored neutrality. Many. Kenobi regarded her sternly, not satisfied with the reply. GD. Too many to count, but the number of Sith I have killed is not that much lower. Comes with the terrain. Tell me, did you enjoy it? Sometimes the unnecessary wastefulness leaves a bitter taste, but yeah, mostly. He paused, weighing his words, before continuing with dejected quietness. Earlier, you expressed your sympathies at my master's passing. Are you even capable of such emotion? Do you realize that GD you gleefully killed all had a master, or an apprentice requiring their guidance? Since I pride myself on thoroughness, I usually made sure I got them both, so. Kenobi blanched, appalled by her callousness. I have trouble connecting the rational woman I was having a considerate discussion with minutes ago, to that vicious monster you're morphing into before my very eyes. No wonder your famed negotiations tend to go awry, if you talk to everyone like that. You see, I was born into war. The GD of my time had just as much blood on their hands. Remember, Imperials were people, too. People with dreams, fears, ambitions, honor, family. One could consider them misguided people serving a murderous regime. He deliberately phrased it that way to get a rise out of it. Sure, why not carpet bomb them all? Don't you enjoy the righteousness of your path? We GD fight to protect others, to re-establish the peace. Even as he said it, Kenobi grimaced, as if the words turned into ash in his mouth. So did we, in a sense. A life taken is just that. Let me ask you, if you were faced with people instead of droids in this war, what would change for you? You'd still need to defend against them. She made a sweeping motion. And up goes the death score. One would hope that we have learned from such horrors occurring in the past, at the very least. He Criffing evaded the question. It would be a far more honorable war than pitting expendable clones versus expendable droids, while the GD played the heroes. Kenobi gaped at her for a moment. You think we wanted any of this? He asked incredulously. It's a Criffing army. Not that I blame you. Just don't try to fool yourselves into believing yourselves above the bloodshed. Accept that conflict is a way of life. You of all people should understand that, what with your Mandalorian mistress, Duchess Satine is a pacifist, more than even me, regrettably. You keep implying I am romantically involved with her. What gave you that idea? The GD protested half-heartedly. So you do not love her? That means you almost fell over nothing. Something darkly possessive flickered behind his eyes. You are correct. I do love her, with all my heart, but I choose not to act upon it. It was Zathras' turn to sigh. Because you are afraid you're too weak. She had not expected him to give an honest answer. Yes, Zathras allowed him a minute to let the admission sink in, before she picked up the strands of their conversation again. Are they dead? This time, she did not need to clarify. The press. He was unable to put up much of a fight after you grievously injured him. I killed him like the rabid animal he gave himself license to behave as. She could see his jaw working as he processed his unbecoming choice of words. Curiously, he vanished in a wisp of green smoke. As for Maul, I regrettably cannot say for certain. I wounded him, severed his arms, but then he attempted to escape. I pulled him back and he just fell from the building. So there was nothing to report. Anything I could have claimed on the topic of their fate would put others in danger if I was wrong. It's quite hilarious how your silver tongue seems to work on yourself, too. I didn't take you for a void dang ad hypocrite, Kenobi. He squirmed under her look. As a friendly piece of advice and speaking from first-hand experience, you should have made sure. Sith have a curious tendency to defy death. I know, Maul especially. I thought I had killed Maul before, on Naboo, after he slew my master. When I realized Satine had been brought to safety, I just couldn't bring myself to go looking for his corpse. You didn't want to continue down the path of revenge. It's a little terrifying how well you can read me. It's true. I suppressed my emotions about what happened on Naboo for years. When they emerged again, I simply knew dwelling on Maul would consume me. What is it about the dark that has you all so petrified? If I didn't know better, I would think you acknowledge its superiority. He refilled their cups once more, failing to mask the slight trembling of his hands. Most Jedi believe that the original self dies when falling completely. Not just by accident lashing out of anger, but by actively embracing the dark. Why the distinction, though? Well, to take the term literally, if you catch someone while they fall, there is still hope. But when they hit the bottom of the abyss, they shatter and are remade in the image of the dark side. Have their values turned upside down. You, on the other hand, essentially started from the ground, so it wouldn't be the same for you, would it? There's much room to fall for me, as well. I have seen depths of superlative depravity I wouldn't even consider. I thought myself a monster. I played in rivers of blood and laughed as innocence quaked. An echo of Hargrave's words rang in her ear. But I am not afraid. If it was necessary to give oneself over so completely, I would do it in a heartbeat. My training is dedicated to making sure it does not become a necessity. It's not power if it dominates you. There is a fine line between the dark side freeing you and letting it enslave you in turn. Her determined rhetoric took on a more meditative quality, as though speaking only to herself. Over the years, however, one realization has stood out with utter clarity: mastering the dark side is not enough. It never was. Star. For all your power, what would make such its in essence a sacrifice, isn't it? Necessary. Kenobi prodded shrewdly. A man can have anything, if he is willing to sacrifice. Star. An involuntary shudder ran down at the unbidden memory. From a certain point of view, I suppose it would be. When I thought I made. Contrary to what you might think, I am not a sadist. Many of my peers were in the habit of randomly murdering officers or bystanders for their own perverse enjoyment. I try to remain above such base violence. However, as I went through the motions of gaining power, from apprentice to lord and beyond even such ranks, for all the theoretical freedom the Force gave me, someone was always yanking my chain. Terminal, bars, vitiate, boring, mar, even longer. And now. Actually, I am helping you reach the full extent of your capabilities, as if you are using me for your own gain at the same time. True, but isn't it just pragmatic? And don't we share the vision of transforming the world? Let's just say when Valkorion urged you to kneel before him, when he claimed to share his power with you, we both know what his true intentions were. I would never ask you to kneel. How craffing magnanimous of you. A chain I should not have in the first place. Pressuring me into roles I did not want, coercing me into taking approaches I considered inferior, detrimental to the Empire, or went against my priorities. I will not play the victim of circumstance. I did all those things, but not because I desired them. That's the crux. I did it because I was weak. As a result, I lost people I should have been strong enough to protect, took part in senseless carnage. I swore to myself that I would never be helpless against the whims of anyone, and this is why you and I are so much alike, dear Wrath. Sathras picked up her cup, only to realize that it was empty. As for your theory, through all that, I have not lost myself. You are Wrath made flesh. I am not your Wrath, Vitiate. I am your executioner. Remember me, when your alliance burns to ash. Star. The memory dissipated as abruptly as it had washed over her. Her grimace had not gone unnoticed. Are you alright? There was no point in trying to salvage her image when she had revealed so much already. At least they were even in that regard. Brutal honesty was to be, then. Of course. I just did not expect our conversation to take such an intimate turn. I doubt anyone else has managed to catch a glimpse of your inner darkness. And I admittedly have never bared my mind like this to, well, anyone, on purpose, at least. I am looking at you, Nox. The innocuous whistling that ensued echoed through her skull, coming to a grating crescendo before she shut him out in annoyance. Not even the select people you claim to care about, no? Too much of a risk, either to them or me. To give you an example. My own husband tried to assassinate me. He was in fact loyal to my master at that time. Granted, he wanted it to fail, so at least he had the decency to face me in combat, instead of poisoning me in my sleep or something. That's messed up. I see a running theme here, though is a Sith's life not driven by perpetual fear. Your quest for power, the facade of strength you must keep up, the need to dominate, so you can save those you're afraid to lose. Given enough power, there is nothing to fear. An apex predator can still succumb to disease. He rose from his cushion and returned to the kitchenette, taking the teapot with him. So, have you reached that goal yet? He has a robust tendency to get under your skin. Remarkable, Boyd. He would be absolutely perfect. Looks like you found a worthy challenge. I could say, yes, of course, and that it is a path available to you, as well. The classic approach was getting nowhere, but they both knew it, and had long made a game of it. Kenobi turned around and leaned against the cupboard leisurely. Then again, it would be a lie. Because it never really ends, does it? He analyzed shrewdly, his voice incongruously soft. I think I understand now. That is why peace is life from your point of view. I suppose asking nicely will not convince you to consider joining me, either. No, but it will yield you another pot of tea. I shall content myself with that. For the moment, and bear in mind that no one who's not on the High Council is supposed to learn of your, well, alignment. Obi-Wan quietly briefed her as they were about to enter the archives. Not that I am complaining, but if I intended to betray you, that would be quite counterproductive. Unsuspecting GD are easy prey. Ironically, I find myself agreeing with you. However, the council decided that the risk of discord outweighs the likelihood of you turning on us. Just yet. The words were on his lips, but he did not say them. Questionable reasoning, though I suppose you have no choice but to trust me anyway. Given that you tried to lure me to the dark side just this morning, trust is a little fickle at the moment, and you came out unscathed. Can't fault me for trying. She idly brushed her fingers over one of the busts framing the hallway leading to the inner gallery of the library. I admit I am a little curious, has your spiel ever worked? Most of the time, actually. Haven't had the opportunity to try my hand on a master, though usually only Padawans and knights are inexperienced enough to listen. Kenobi abruptly stopped in his tracks. You twisted the minds of children. No, because in my time, Padawans were usually of age, not the child soldiers you've turned them into. This time at least, I am not the one with the questionable morals. As if you care. Petty. But you're right, I don't particularly care about the recruitment and training scheme of the GD Order. I just wonder why you don't, either. She replied, voice slightly raised. The GD sitting at one of the hall terminal desks, looked up from this work as they approached and rose swiftly to meet them, breaking into a delighted smile. Zathras inclined her head in greeting. I am glad to see you have recovered from your injuries. I would not be here if not for your heroic effort. I had hoped our paths would cross again, so that I could give you my thanks. Now this is quite a coincidence. Puzzled, Kenobi glanced between them. You have met O. He swerved around to face the woman beside him, a hilariously conflicting sequence of expressions flitting across his face. I really must be losing my edge. He muttered, audible only to Zathras. So the original retelling of events suffered a few key omissions. Not missing a beat, she grinned slyly. Of course, but actually nothing of consequence transpired. But if why the Criff isn't Tyrannus dead, then... She added in her head as Kenobi failed to finish his sentence. You must really regret not filing that report now. A perfect opportunity to rekindle his residual guilt. That he had grown visibly pale, the potential implications rendering him speechless. The other man watched the cryptic exchange with mounting confusion. Is something the matter, Master Kenobi? No, Archivist Dathan. Kenobi sighed, his right eyebrow twitching. I just realized a grave oversight, which requires no correction nor discussion at the moment, Master GD. Zathras interrupted him. No harm will come from it, I assure you. He flinched involuntarily when she gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. I shall hold you to your word. Another tea session in the evening? He asked in resignation. I'd be delighted. She nodded towards Fakin quizzically. It seems you need little by way of introduction. Lady Zathras, she suppressed a grin at the term of address, is here as an independent researcher. Kenobi seemed to have finally got his act together again. Granted, they were all operating outside of their respective comfort zones, but at some point, the inane apprehension got in the way of productive collaboration. Oh, a fellow historian. That explains a lot, actually. I have been wondering about the odd circumstances under which we met. Wondering, kept you up at night. A reddish tinge appeared on the archivist's cheeks as a result of her teasing words. I probably shouldn't ask, the younger GD vacillated. That would be for the best, yes. So, what is your area of research? Fakin inquired, with no small measure of enthusiasm. The Sith. Zathras stated matter-of-factly. The archivist's eyes grew wide, his mouth opening and closing comically. Kenobi shot her a scathing look before hastening to salvage the situation. She professes to be an expert on, certain eras of non-Republic history, and has kindly agreed to help us track the traces the Sith might left in recent history, in an attempt to learn more about them, and possibly come closer to identifying them. The Council decided an outside perspective might be of use. Would you mind assisting her in this task? Really smooth, Kenobi, when I have no academic level knowledge of history to speak of, let alone anything that happened in the last 4,000 years. We did read up on that in the Achoran library. Don't think that's enough to keep up the facade. Besides, don't tell me you memorized all that pointless drivel. Nah, I'm just chilling in the back of your head, of course I did. We would have wasted our time there otherwise. We did waste time as it hasn't yielded any concrete results. Hasn't it now? Not at all, in fact, we were informed of a visitor just before lunch, and I volunteered. Admittedly, I did not expect this would be the outcome. Such a monumental task, though perhaps another. Madame New assured me you're qualified. She is to be granted full access to historical documents, and non-classified. The distinction earned Kenobi and I will. Current data. I'll leave you to it. May the Force be with you in your endeavor. Don't make me regret it, he mouthed to Zathras when the slightly older GD wasn't looking. I like him already, oh my. He is practically a younger GD version of Talos, and he has such a nostalgic name. It's not impossible that it harkens back to the glorious days. Nox chuckled. Although Bacon was not said to have had any offspring. No, but one of this GD's ancestors could have named himself after the space station. A slave with no family name. An immigrant. It would be a blight on the Grand Moff's legacy to have produced such a tragically inept combatant. At any rate, I wonder if GD are allowed to research their ancestry. I am sure our dear archivist would have, even if it was prohibited. He possesses that kind of irrepressible curiosity. At least we are in good hands in terms of our research. Where would you like to start? How about you tell me what is known about the current generation of Sith? Not much, to be honest. Supposedly, there are always two of them at the same time, and about 200 years ago, someone presumably, a Sith, opened a rift in the Force, which enabled us to sense the dark side for the first time in the 8th century since the new Sith Wars. That's really not much to go by. So they essentially thought the dark side extinct during all that time. Not that more stupid than us blindly following Vitiate for a millennium, true. But for all their failings, the Jedi can't possibly have been that naive. I mean, I can sense it here, the dark, in their Kreffing temple. The whole of Coruscant is immersed in it. Whatever those Sith were doing to cloak their work before, it does not seem to be effective anymore. Has Sidious simply become overconfident and sloppy? No way. Perhaps it is built up to such a degree that he cannot keep it under wraps anymore. I'd seriously doubt his capabilities, then. And still, the Jedi seem unfazed, or rather, oblivious to it. You're right, it's unexpectedly tangible here. Some of it is the holocrons stored somewhere nearby. There are Sith holocrons here. Yep, it feels quite muted, probably security mechanisms of some kind. Can't have the poor librarians risk corruption. There's something else, though. Perhaps that would be really interesting. It is difficult to ascertain the specifics, however. What? During the earliest days of the old Sith Order, when they were basically a faction split off from the Jedi, they had a presence on Coruscant. Asus, Titan. The Jedi tend to build their temples in places strong in the light side, ideally on the side of a Force nexus. Obviously, there's a reason we settled on Corbin, sees. Yes, but my point is that the Force Virgins must have always been here. So you mean, the early Sith had access to it, too? They most definitely would have used it in some way. Precisely. The case of poisoning the well, so to speak. It would greatly facilitate this, I don't know how to call it, shaping of the landscape of the Force. It would be easier to assess the situation if I had a body and didn't have to rely on your perception. You know, I think we might have been underestimating Sidious and his lineage. You and I are more concerned with tangible greatness, the ability to bend the world to our will, so it is natural for us to assume they would primarily be after worldly powers as well. What if they have dedicated themselves to influencing the Force itself? Wouldn't it be an immense help for keeping up their deception? Of course, but it's also major overkill. You fail to take into account what a monumental feat it would be to tilt the balance of the Force like this. This goes beyond even Zeus and Athena. You've got to be joking. Unfortunately, no. No matter how far Vitiate's manipulations of the Force went, they were always dependent on people. So you think they unknowingly plagiarized your idea, in a crude, excessive way, or a more comprehensive manner? You didn't leave a hologram, did you? I am neither that narcissistic nor stupid. Consider this: they already achieved what would have been an impossibility in our empire, and even the Brotherhood of Darkness, if the records described their intentions correctly, that being wiped out. They consistently worked together, successive generations separated by time, united by a common goal. Every single link in the chain on a quest for maximizing his personal power while paving the ground for their successor, instead of undermining their chances. The progress they might have made, slowly but surely, not hampered by constant infighting even in our prime. The whole Dark Council could have meditated together for days, and not yielded such a lasting effect on the Force. I don't like this at all. All the more reason to find Sidious. I really wonder for what purpose he is biding his time politically. The Republic is doomed already, and the war could remain at an impasse for years with no actual progress. I am afraid I don't really see any starting point for historical analysis. Bacon added when she did not continue with more questions. No longer distracted by the internal conversation, Zathras rounded the table and leaned over the screen. In that case, I suggest we begin by analyzing their possible angles of leverage in the present, and corroborate it with historical records to assess the plausibility. I see your dear husband has rubbed off on you. An enemy will almost never be anything except an enemy. All one can do with an enemy is defeat him. But an adversary can sometimes become an ally. There's a cost, of course. In all things in life there's a cost. In dealing with an adversary, sometimes the cost paid in power or position. Sometimes the cost is greater. Sometimes the risk is one's future, or even one's life. But in all such situations, the calculation is straightforward. Whether or not the potential gain is worth the potential loss. And the warrior must never forget that he and his adversary are not the only ones in that equation. Sometimes, all the universe may hang in the balance. Timothy Zahn, Star Wars. Thrawn. See the end of the chapter for more notes. Chapter text. They had wanted this. Explicitly requested a sparring match, ostensibly for academic purposes. In truth, as both sides knew, it was a test gauging their own skills and thus, chances against Sidious as much as evaluating the threat she represented. So their complaints would fall on deaf ears if they got their collective arses handed to them. The anticipation made Zathras' fingers tingle. The only letdown was the choice of weapons. She had almost refused when they handed her the pathetic things. Apparently, they did not trust her to hold back, unsurprising, yet vaguely disappointing. In turn, she watched intently as her opponent dialed down the power output of his own saber. Now that was a feature she would never have considered adding to her weapon, although she recognized that it could be useful in some situations, just not in battle. Although the low-power hum of the practice sabers leave it to the GD to castrate an inherently lethal weapon was grating, at least it was not screaming hysterically at her, like those of Katuni and Kenobi had. How she missed her crimson blades. Stats of warblades were fine for starting out with melee weapons, but even those could be deadly if one was not careful, though not necessarily for the wielder. In that way, practice sabers were safer, which was precisely what made them so boring and ineffective for learning purposes. How can one learn to fight properly without a sense of actual danger? The GD argued that actual lightsabers were too risky for children to use, but most Sith had started training early as well, and at such a young age, it had been in nobody's interest to weed out the weaker ones yet. It would be irresponsible for a parent to coddle their children. Giving them a harmless weapon, a contradiction in itself, would douse their natural eagerness and deal what could only be a blow to their confidence. How else would you teach your child responsibility, if not by trusting them to understand the obligation that came with wielding a blade? And if an overzealous 6-year-old really managed to chop his arm off while fooling around, well, at least it was not too late for them to embark on a less physically demanding path of training, or to get accustomed to fighting with a prosthetic. If they killed someone else, a rare occurrence for all she knew, though historically it had led to Kagath in one instance that would be more problematic, but on par with the same happening during their academy education. And if the victim were a friend, it would give the child an early taste of the depths of the dark side. Then it was up to the family to direct the resulting emotions into the right channels. Never let it be said that parenting was a trivial task. Though she could not speak from first-hand experience, she had seen how much could go wrong in that regard, judging from the examples the other students on Corbin had set. Given his earlier attitude, it was only logical for her to pick Windu as her first opponent. The match started off cautiously enough, both circling each other, searching for an opening, until Xanthrus's patience ran out, and she leapt towards him to deal the first strike. The fight instantly spiraled to a ridiculous, entirely unexpected intensity from there. From the outside, it had to look like a completely random blur of green and purple, devoid of discernible patterns, the individual attacks nearly invisible to the naked eye. The perfect illusion of disorder, delivered with malignant grace. Windu was not editing. A GD, playing around with what could only be described as a modified Gyal form. What was more, it appeared that he, too, became more powerful, his attacks more ferocious as she opened herself up further to her passion, and sank deeper into the embrace of the dark. As though he somehow leached off her emotions, but she could not feel any connection, any draining effect that would make this conceivable. None of her feints seemed to catch him off guard, as if could predict her every move, which should be an impossibility with Gyal. Considering his odd technique, perhaps that was the key. Could he mirror her somehow? The mutual escalation continued to make the fight insanely fast, so she clipped the second saber to her belt, and switched to a more controllable gem so in an attempt to slow him down, requiring him to counter her more powerful strikes. He did not need longer than a few heartbeats to adapt to the change, still not giving her any openings. Their sabers deadlocked at chest level, neither able to overpower the other. His eyes darkened with something bordering on anger, his previously dispassionate face a mask of aggression. But she didn't know better. She'd think Windu enjoyed combat more than he should, his presence alight with the thrill of battle. It was less contained than she had come to expect from a GD, flowing seamlessly into the force that surrounded them, his composure characterized by zeal rather than staunch duty. How long can you keep this up, before the dark claims its due? She taunted him, voice strained from the effort. Longer than I will require to defeat you. His lips curled in a snarl. Spoken like a true keeper of the peace, small droplets of perspiration formed on his forehead. She gradually shifted her weight backwards, pretending to try to overcome the stalemate by moving out of his range. When he followed her movement, she stepped to the side, half behind him, and reached over his raised arm with one hand, gripping his wrist. Able to control his motion thus, she ducked slightly and charged forward, throwing him on his back. Recovering quickly, too quickly for her liking, he retaliated by attempting to sweep out the legs under her without success, and press the offense. Theoretically, the fight could go on forever unless she switched gears significantly. This was a confrontation not to be won by pure physical prowess. And with their fighting styles so similar, there were no inherent weaknesses of their saberplate to exploit. She tilted back her blade from a high parry, and slammed the hilt into Windu's temple. It caused him to stagger back briefly, buying her much-needed time to reconsider her tactics. There was a risk of her giving away too much, however, her curiosity won out, the virtual impasse lending itself to a unique experiment. She ignited the other saber again, and, closely observing her opponent, reached into the torrent of fury again. Noticing the concentrated effort of Windu to attain control over himself without raising any shields and subsequent shift of his presence, confirmed her suspicions. He was tapping into the dark side by proxy of her emotions, apparently without it affecting him directly. Although the foundations were undeniably there, his immense power did not merely come from his inner darkness, rather he allowed himself to turn into perfect conduit, requiring her to close the loop. That would be his undoing. Gradually, she eased into her own channeling meditation, lessening the power output until the loop ran dry. There were now two blank slates opposing one another, with no possibility for him to draw on her power. Windu furrowed his brows in perplexity. She could feel him attempting to read her, straining to understand her radically changed state of mind. It was a strangely unsettling kind of probing, almost intimate, brushing close to her core being. Time to teach the impertinent GD a lesson. She gathered the extreme focus needed to use Chio to its full extent, and plunged herself into her cultivated rage, letting it ripple through her body, until every fiber was satiated with it, finding a place within the eye of the storm from which to strike from, having attained mastery over chaos itself. Windu reeled from the emotional whiplash. His eyes widened as he rushed to latch onto the avalanche, threatening to wash over him, to bury him in suffocating darkness, thus springing the trap. Contrary to his expectations, it was not a focused attack to crush his mind with torturous thoughts. Zathras poured more and more rage and dark emotions into the conjured, employing the transcending technique to detach it from herself, letting it fill her opponent, instead of putting it to use. It felt painfully draining, but that only gave her more strength in turn. Windu delved deeper into his technique in turn, realizing her goal only when it was too late. With no way of closing the loop on his own to let it flow back out of him, the flames ravaged him. Unused to dealing with so much sheer darkness, it threatened to overwhelm him, rendering him powerless against the unrelenting waves crushing against his mental fortifications. Where before he had danced around the crater of a volcano without feeling the searing heat, he was now hanging over the edge with only one hand holding onto the crumbling ground, his resolve slowly melting away. She jeered in triumph, a vicious teeth-baring smile marring her face. She had been right. Windu's mysterious technique required the Darksider to use the Force normally, or with the intent to directly cause harm, not to overload the capacity of the circuit he created, to make it bounce often. The veins on Windu's forehead bulging with exertion, he tried to pull away from her, but wherever he turned, there was no solace to be found. Blood trickling from his nose, mouth agape in a silent scream, he struggled alone against the dark trapped inside of him, while his peers watched, aghast, not comprehending what was happening. She finally gave him a little reprieve. The GD Master dropped to the ground and bent over, trembling hands on his thighs. He looked up slowly with watery, baleful eyes. Zathras sank down to one knee, until their faces were on the same level, as if to soothe him. With a smirk, she drove the saber through his upper chest and twisted it for good measure. The pain sent him over the edge. With a desperate roar, his hand shot up to her throat, only to jerk back as if burned, and sank down limply, as Windu collapsed from the strain. The ensuing shock silence was deafening. Talk. Talk. The sound of the little greenish creature's walking stick reverberated through the room. He leaned over Windu, brushing his three-fingered hand over the man's face, and closed his eyes meditatively. No you do, what done you have? I've given him a small taste of the real dark side. He should know better than to play with fire. A duel upon death, not meant to be, this was. He chastised the Sith. What are you talking about? He'll be fine. A little traumatized, perhaps so, he was going to hate her. Besides, pain is a highly effective teacher. Much better than death. Teach what you intended. It's not my task to teach you anything, but yours to learn. I have shown him the folly of underestimating the nature of the dark. You think Sidious will not exploit his arrogance? At least Windu is not going to make the same mistake twice. Master Yoda used the Force to levitate his unconscious peer, gently setting him down on a stretcher, and gestured for 2 guards to carry him out of the sparring room. An older human male she had not seen before, now the only one present who was not part of the council, stepped up. Harsh methods, Sith, and you are, Syndralig. Battlemaster of the Order. I met one of your predecessors. I met you happened to me, face in combat. He asked snidely as he adjusted the clip, pulling his silver-gray hair back in a flowing ponytail. Alas, I never had that particular pleasure. She pulled her tunic into position and passed the lightsaber into her left hand. Ready for another experiment, Nox. Any terms for our duel? Don't want to exceed the capacity of your medical wing. None? No holding back. Just be aware that I possessed no unique abilities that could be turned against me. Several minutes into the fight, Zathras had to admit that Dralig was quite formidable, if rather annoying, but the latter was true for the majority of GD. Seamlessly integrating techniques from nearly all forms and combining sequences in an utterly innovative manner, he represented an invigorating challenge that was not spoiled by her opponent employing fancy, arcane powers. Finally, she felt wholly alive again, with the aggressive rhythm of combat thrumming in her veins. Despite his air of superiority, Dralig was calm and serene, a far cry from Windu's fierce authority. He baited her, having lain in wait for the right moment to launch into a nimble flow of attacks, that ended with a horizontal sweep across her midriff, that she only barely managed to dodge. There was a gasp from one of the onlookers, clearly disagreeing with the appropriateness of the attempted side-talk strike. There is no contemplation, there is only duty. The corners of her lips twitching upwards, she added, you know, people who threaten me have an abysmal mortality rate. He did not acknowledge her enigmatic comment, and instead erected a force barrier around himself that withstood even the most brutal barrage of attacks. You heavily favor Jaya. You will find it possesses just as many inherent flaws as all other forms. Don't you dare lecture me, old man. And you will find yourself screaming in agony once I am done with you. Zathras spat. In a sense, he was right. However, due to the immense focus it required, Gyro was extremely draining and intended for ending a battle swiftly, its speed and unpredictability lending itself to near-instant victory. Drawing out the fight with Windu and now, the Battlemaster as she had, was generally unwise. Taking advantage of her brief distraction, Droid jumped over her head then followed the acrobatic maneuver with a strike before his feet touched the ground. She swatted away his blade in time, but her counterattack was cut short by an impeccably well-timed force push that nearly sent her flying into a pillar. Loosening her grip on the ground, she merely skidded several meters back, her right hand sliding on the floor as she regained her balance. It was in that moment that Droid rolled forward and ignited his saber at the end, driving it through her exposed left knee. Appropriately armored, that would not have been a problem at all. The council having forbidden her to wear her usual attire since it was too menacing, even the low-powered blade caused a jolt of agony to run up her leg. Nevertheless, that was nothing compared to the humiliation constricting her chest. Should have seen that one coming. The Battlemaster eyed her impassively as he allowed her to get up. She would make sure he regretted his clemency, she swore to herself, gingerly putting weight on the injured limb to test it. The pain was insignificant, it improved her focus, if anything, but the affected tendons would need first and foremost rest to recover. And now, for the grand finale. She beckoned Droid to attack. For a few moments, their fight continued as it had before, slowed down by her opting to take a defensive approach as she deepened her focus. When her opponent overswung before an attack, she took a step back and raised her left hand, fingers shifting their position on the hilt, constituting the only warning. He was lifted into the air, and a shocked gasp later, dropped his weapon as both his hands went to his throat, fumbling to pry away the invisible grip choking the air from him. Zathras cocked her head. Got more wisdom to share, Battlemaster? She asked sardonically. When she tightened her grasp further, just short of damaging his airways permanently, a spark of resolve surged through Droid. This time, however, she was prepared for his force-based attack, and absorbed the push with ease. In retaliation, a stream of pale blue lightning poured from her right hand into his struggling form. You will have to drop him if you want to hear his screams. Chuckling, Zathras complied and let up the pressure on her victim's neck, only to rev up the lightning. A raw, agonized cry ripped from Droid's throat. In tune with the bright current of pure hatred, it was almost melodic. You know, I always considered you quite insane, but this is surprisingly entertaining, she remarked to Nox. A pity I can't see it through to its conclusion. With a sigh, she ceased the torturous attack, a few stray sparks dancing round her hand afterwards. In an impressive display of resilience, the Battlemaster pushed himself to all fours, panting. His muscles twitching, it was evidently only through sheer willpower that he managed to make a gesture symbolizing the acceptance of his defeat. The Nautilus Master Kit Fisto, if she remembered correctly, wordlessly helped him out of the dueling space. This time, Yoda did not scold her verbally, but he regarded her with eyes narrowed in silent reprimand or suspicion. Any more volunteers, or have you seen enough? Zathras crossed her arms, quickly growing bored, while the other GD fussed over Droid. Kenobi exchanged a look with Yoda. It was only when the latter nodded that he approached her, nonchalantly shaking off his cloak as he did so. Be gentle. I am due for deployment soon. Zathras nodded curtly and ignited her sabers, arms hanging lazily by her side. Hardly a surprise, the GD adopted the ready stance of Seresu, a visual challenge for the opponent. She began with the wide and powerful strikes of Gemso once more. Kenobi parried her attacks almost effortlessly, even routinely, as if he regularly trained for precisely such a scenario. To her frustration, she already felt the first hints of fatigue setting. She hadn't slept properly for several days, and not yet overcome the crash from the high of the lightning usage against the Separatist forces. To channel such energy without much in the way of practice was unexpectedly taxing. It took a toll in the form of all-over soreness and heart palpitations, which Nox had assured her were temporary, and always happened to him, too, when he needed to heal others under strain. Still, it felt like it could easily bring her to brink of death, if she overdid it. Kenobi was keenly aware of her exhaustion and all too eager to exploit it. She decided to play along, giving him such openings to lure him out of his almost impenetrable defense. To her astonishment, one of his swift counterattacks was successful, landing what would have been a critical cut on her inner thigh. Crippling with a real saber, utterly deadly with a warblade unless the blood flow was suppressed in time. Having dominated her other challengers, she saw no harm in humoring the GD, which gave her an opportunity to learn more about him. She allowed Kenobi to drag out the match, migrating it onto his terms as he leveled the playing field by exhausting her, which was a major strength of Seresu anyway. He deflected her wary attempts at conjuring more lightning easily. Weaving unexpected Atero elements into his style, he kept her on her toes with rapid direction switches. It was obvious he had had ample opportunity to analyze her blade work. They moved across room as their fight gained intensity once more. She transitioned from a low parry into a spinning attack, and finished with a sweep towards Kenobi's exposed back. The saber nicked his hip, but failed to have the intended reach. She leapt up and brought both blades down in an overhead blow. Again, her opponent was prepared. Kenobi's riposte turned out to be a ruse, and when he batted both of her sabers to one side, her evasive reaction to an actual upward slash came a fraction too late. She ignored the brief sting of pain of what would have cut her left arm off at the shoulder. Now standing behind Kenobi as he spun around, she feinted a low thrust. There, directing the movement of her opponent, she forced him backwards with staccato attacks from both sides. Locking them left his core area wide open, so Zathras pulled back briefly to follow up with a final broad sweep. Not meeting any resistance from Kenobi's blade, she overswung but continued on the same trajectory, surging forward and bringing her blade to his throat. "You're dead, General Kenobi." The cocky smirk on his face was unexpected. "At least I meet my demise in the knowledge of having taken my opponent with me." It took her longer than it should have to notice the hilt of Kenobi's unignited saber, pointed towards her solar plexus. The GD smile broadened with roguish missive. The Force telegraphed to warn him. All she saw was before the world grew mute was a bright flash of blue. Pain bloomed in her stomach much later. Her mind short-circuited as Kenobi's stunned face morphed into Valens and then, arcans, a dark red tinge crawling into her vision. Automatically, as if her body was not her own, both her hands shot forward, sending Kenobi hurtling towards the wall with such velocity that most bones in his body would have been crushed upon impact. Only the quick reflexes of his peers saved him. The red turned into black and then she knew no more. "And he forgave me. What more do you want? Never before have I apologized to a GD." Zathras hissed resentfully. "Master Time, she has." He saw what she did to Mace and Master Droid. Much to Obi-Wan's consternation, the Itachi Master interrupted him, his voice raising. "She would have killed you on the spot, if not for Master Yoda's and Plo Koon's reflexes. It was not intentional." The Sith rolled her yellow eyes indignantly. "That does not put my mind at ease at all." She pushed herself off the medical bed. "You know what, Curfew? I am leaving. Go meditate on this or something, but I am not entering into a screaming match with a wimpy bunch of void dang at GD." Tyne stepped between her and the door. "You're leaving. Where to?" "To orchestrate our impending doom." The Sith threw her head back in exasperation and stared at the ceiling. "This is another very out-of-character thing for me to say, but if you continue down this panic-crazed path, you're doing Sidious's job for her. Fear leads to the dark side and all that." She enunciated slowly as if speaking to a group of spooked cretulins. "Well, I sense a lot of fear. It's getting really infuriating. Seriously, your rampant irrationality is driving me crazy, and I have always valued my relative sanity rather highly. If you're one of the sanest Sith, I am rather glad we won't get to meet so many others." Obi-Wan muttered. "Pardon me." She balked, yet a faint smirk tugged at the corners of her lips. "Give me a holocall once you've calmed down. And send Windu my regards when he wakes up." Obi-Wan coughed politely. "I honestly don't think he wants to be reminded of you so soon. That's the point." "Well, I am thrilled to see the two of you getting along so splendidly," Kit Fisto deadpanned, "but Master Tyne is right to be cautious. If your intent is to get us to calm down, as you put it, it would be immensely helpful to know where you're about to go." "To my day job." "That is unexpected." His lecher rippled with surprise as well. "You hold down a job?" Fisto repeated sluggishly, disbelief coloring the statement. The woman shrugged innocently, which coupled with the burning eyes, projected the harmlessness of an acolyte, and looked virtually as terror-inducing as her angry face. At least one knew to expect to enter a world of pain in the latter case. "Since I have not yet mastered the art of drawing sustenance purely from the dying screams of my foes, it's an unfortunate necessity. Let me take a guess, Guardian." Obi-Wan could not help but quip, which drew a simultaneously long-suffering and utterly confused stare from the Nodlin. Surely, it would be something along the lines of bounty hunting. Now that would be the epitome of evil. She purred with a chuckle. "I am part of the Achoran Senator's security detail. There's a Sith working in the Senate." Master Tyne ground out, struggling to get his uneven breathing under control. "I am a senatorial employee. Hardly the springboard for galactic domination. But you're right, it wasn't exactly hard to get in, and I know next to nothing about present-day affairs of the Republic, and admittedly still struggle with your inefficiently fancy tech interfaces on occasion, even the dang at fresher controls." They thought it necessary to innovate something like that. She stopped her rant when she noticed the GD looking at her strangely. "Anyway, ahem, if I can blend in, I would not be surprised if Sidious has embedded countless loyal agents in your political system and the military. Perhaps he has already taken over the Senate without you noticing." "We serve the Senate," Fisto protested. "See the problem right there? Are you here to provide malicious commentary while we walk towards our own funeral? I don't see you helping at all. You have injured some of our most proficient swordsmen. Not this again. Out." Her sharp command rang through the small room. "The arrogance. You are guests in our temple, you can't order us around." CC Tyne complained. "Well, you're still standing in my way, in case you haven't noticed." There is no point in antagonizing her, Obi-Wan thought, slowly backing towards the door. Postponing this discussion would be for the Kenobi. "You stay." He abruptly stopped in his tracks. Making eye contact with his fellow council members, Obi-Wan spread his hands in a reluctant, apologetic gesture. "Perhaps I can help to defuse the situation. I don't know why I put up with you people. Zathra slopped back onto the medical bed when the other two GD had filed out of the room, burying her face in her hands. I wonder about that as well, but find great comfort in the fact that at least no one has got killed yet. You've got rather low expectations for successful diplomatic relations. She peered out between her spread fingers. Stemming from years of experience, unfortunately, it's only been 2 days. She stressed with indignation. I'd wager that must be a new record of restraint for you, Dang it. The Sith muttered as she abruptly sat up. Fine. And started removing her tunic. As this Obi-Wan didn't know what to make of her action. There seems to be a misunderstanding. Yeah, yours. She lifted up the simple black top she wore underneath, baring her upper body without hesitation. Below her sternum, there was a pale brown scar, undoubtedly from a lightsaber. A fresh purple bruise with an angry red edge overlapped it, shifted slightly to the left. She let the realization set in before covering her stomach again. Obi-Wan blinked in horror. You're lucky to have survived that. Especially considering that Qui-Gon had succumbed to precisely such an injury. I had survived worse, but this has left a mark. When you stabbed me, what were you thinking, by the way? It triggered unpleasant memories. I am truly sorry, you could not have known. She dismissed his apology. But I am pleasantly surprised you possess such a vicious, vengeful streak. More like reckless stupidity, that, too. She snorted a good-natured laugh. While we are at it, could you refrain from trying to squash me like an insect next time? You're planning on pulling a similar stunt. No, I have learned my lesson. He was not sure what to say to keep the conversation going. She really had a knack for derailing him every single time. I didn't know a Sith could suffer from PTSD. Okay, that was probably the wrong thing. I am not ill. This is just something I had compartmentalized, I guess. You GD release your feelings into the Force, right? Well, alternatively one can turn them into a source of power, but that requires facing them first. Analyze your situation, identify the emotions and turn them into something you can harness. I mean, you could probably do without the analytical step, though that usually results in aimlessly hating everything and everyone, thus, becoming a creature of mindless malice. Taking responsibility is much more effective, more targeted, it's also more painful. There was so much going on during that time and I wasn't. My mind wasn't quite my own, it was easier to forget than to risk exposing weaknesses. What happened, if you don't mind me asking? He realized he was treading on thin ice, but she was being unexpectedly forthcoming with insights into her psyche, manipulative as it may have been. I do, but I also want you to understand. Contrary to what you might think, there were enemies I couldn't obliterate just like that. She flicked her wrist in an imitation of snapping someone's neck with the Force. I ended up in prison in Carbonite for years, while they wrecked the Empire and the Republic alike. The woman supplied reluctantly. Hence the alliance, yes. The scar I got because I refused to be twisted into becoming the Emperor's loyal underling. He tried to lure me with the promise of power, but his true intent all along was molding me into a vessel for his spirit. It was all a big charade, orchestrated at the whims of a man so drunk on power, that we were all dead pieces to him, and then he flipped the board just because. In a sense, my foes were his victims as well, but their biggest mistake was making it personal by murdering people who mattered to me. One was like the little sister I never had. Was that genuine care he sensed? I consider that one of my greatest failures, even though I killed them in the end, the whole wretched family of psychopaths. She concluded darkly. Now that description failed to make sense to him, but fortunately, those events of the past would have no bearing on the present. The more interesting question was, why though? She furrowed her brows. Why I failed? No, why tell me this? Does it not constitute weakness? Perhaps I am just bored. She held his gaze, and the world around him lurched, a booming voice slithering into his head. Remember me, when your alliance burns to ash. Star. What was that? Obi-Wan gasped after the fleeting sensation had disappeared. A memory, don't ask, just don't. I am glad you seek to relieve your boredom by talking. The alternative options could be much worse. Oh, definitely. Her sudden exuberant smile felt not quite sincere. Not that he complained. He would pick a falsely cheerful Sith over a maliciously scheming one every day. Senator Iskar had been less than thrilled about her abrupt disappearance, and remaining out of contact for more than a week. Fortunately, he had bought her excuse about following the lad, which wasn't exactly untrue, but well, it didn't matter if she got paid for her time. There was always petty crime as a backup plan. The Choran senator had a mission prepared for her already. Though he was sparse on details on the how, as per usual, he had found a rather promising paper trail. Just when an increase of funds had been granted to the Strategic Advisory Cell, hints of a shipment intended for delivery to a Republic research facility appeared, the lack of documentation indicating military, not commercial. However, thereafter, nothing came through sanctioned channels at all. Iskar had traced the actual delivery operation to a minor smuggler ring. In itself, it was not peculiar. Experimental tech for classified projects could plausibly take such an unofficial route during wartime. In the end, the Senate would be clueless, the details glossed over in the budget reports they got to see. What was conspicuous about the procedure was the timing, which had triggered Iskar taking a closer look. He had been coerced into signing exploration contracts of the defunct mines on Achor, which he claimed had been shut down after the precious metals, precisely because of sporadic findings of crystals, making further digging impossible, with the technology available to Achor at that time. And not only that, the trail abruptly ended. The Republic had never received the mysterious shipment, but again, no official attempt to recover it was made. The affair could only reasonably be explained by involvement of Republic intelligence, if at all. This in particular was what raised the Achoran senator's heckles. He feared their meddling on his homeworld. Iskra was suspiciously well connected, especially for an insignificant senator of a backorder planet. For all his borderline seditious intentions, associating with the criminal underworld still seemed repugnant to him, yet he navigated the terrain with ease, displaying extensive knowledge about it. Zathras had long assumed that the so-called revolution was not an isolated phenomenon limited to Achor. Perhaps it constituted a general popular uprising in the making. It was a certainty that people dissatisfied with the Republic existed who would not run into the open arms of the soulless corporate and financial conglomerate that drove the success of the Confederacy. This, she could work with. The ramifications of Iskra's theory were significant. The sudden requirement for Kyber crystals could only one thing. Safe to say, unless someone was planning to covertly construct a whole lot of lightsabers, they had more far-reaching plans. Zathras couldn't shake the thought that this war was gratuitously expensive. Establishing an adequate army after a millennium of peace was a daunting task, but the way the Republic went about it arguably well-nigh maximized their spending. Researching Kyber-based weapons, how they could have lost all the scientific progress achieved long ago, while the archives were full of political speeches and philosophical drivel dating back as far as the Jedi, was a conundrum would swallow up enormous funds. Then again, the creation of the clone army certainly hadn't come cheap, either. The theory neatly explained why the shipment had to take a clandestine route, with the de facto embargo on Kyber imposed by the GD Order, about the only manifestation of the meager political power they still wielded. Getting to the bottom of this was going to take a while, so she wished she had jotted Kenobi a brief message informing him that she would drop off the radar for a bit, lest they think she was going to bring Tyrannus down on them or something. Eventually, her investigation led her on board a smuggler's ship as a stowaway. This way of traveling was not her first choice. The crew did not present a challenge, but the thought of the utter helplessness in case they got in trouble was disquieting. This was something she had always disliked about ships, the way they limited her options, rubbing in vulnerabilities a Sith should be above having in the first place. What was worse, it was an embarrassment, with one half of her ancestry consisting almost exclusively of proud members of the Imperial Navy for generations. Her relief upon landing the long journey had gone without a hitch was short-lived. Wariness replaced it immediately, when she sensed the utter emptiness surrounding the landing site. The smugglers were just as confused, venturing into the complex with their weapons drawn. Zathras followed at a safe distance. A few steps into the underground building, the scenery changed abruptly, turning into a landscape of twisted metal and debris. The surfaces glistened with a slowly drying substance. The bubbly texture indicated that it had been a kind of foam before degrading. The second fact that stood out was the extreme cold, which caused Zathras to use the force to keep from shivering. Despite the horrendous scale of destruction, the facility's high technological standard was obvious. It must have served as a lab of some kind, instead of the mere storage facility Iskra had assumed it to be. The floor was ripped away in places, revealing the completely scorched levels below. Zathras ducked into the next room, careful not to slip on the slimy residue, and climbed down to assess the damage. When she stepped on the blackened floor on the lowest accessible, the duracrete crumbled beneath her boot. Only ridiculously high temperature would render the material so brittle. Fire had ravaged the labs further up, but everything in this room was completely pulverized. The uppermost level had remained largely unaffected by the inferno, thanks to the fire containment system kicking in, as evidenced by the foam. Down here, there was merely ash. While she could not directly perceive radiation, its damaging effect on the body would be easy to feel. There was none, yet a sense of acute danger remained. During her climb back up, the extreme destruction rendering further exploration attempts absolutely futile. It went from a malevolent whisper in the force to a rather real, piercing cacophony of screams coming from above. Looks like someone was more successful in their search. It did not take long for the nightmarish noise to taper out, and when Zathras finally reached the area it had originated from, only silence and the grisly mutilated corpses of the smuggler crew greeted her. Blood pooled on the ground, a thick layer of various shades ranging from bright scarlet to dark purple. Ha! Got to hand it to whoever did this, at least it was quite efficient. And they even took the time to sever every single tentacle of that Nautolan guy in a precise manner. Dang, look at the Toggerton captain. I didn't know that unlike Leku, Montrals were hollow on the inside. Didn't want to know, actually. Getting squeamish, I've seen worse. It's just the meticulousness of it is astonishing. Looks like they methodically removed every body part that isn't found in baseline humans. Then again, the assailants don't like humans, either, at least not enough to leave them alive. Yeah, no survivors here. The faint whirring sound of servometers announced that she had company, causing her to duck underneath the contorted meeting table. Several assistance droids hovered into the room, their mechanical limbs clicking excitedly. They descended upon the bodies, scanning them. One of them beeped an alarm. It activated a little tool, not unlike a surgical saw, and began cutting off the solitary horn left on the skull of a burly Zabrak. Probably missed it on its first round. Thus we found the culprits. Murderous tech droids, who would have thought? Another droid floated down and began scanning the floor, emitting a high-pitched signal when he found a shoeprint he could not identify. This is where the fun begins. Zathras jumped up from behind her cover and slammed the flipped-over table into the droids, squashing all but two. Waves of blood splashed on her when the heavy piece of furniture landed on the floor and skidded on the sticky liquid due to the slight tilt of the room. They promptly attacked her, targeting vital spots of her body with amazing dexterity and precision. The Sith froze the one to her left in midair, and used her right hand to crush the other's circuits with the Force, before cutting the immobilized droid with the vibroblade she'd found on one of the corpses. These smugglers were really pathetic, to lose against a handful of droids that needed their wiring checked. Even as she formulated that thought, the buzzing noise resurged, and the room was flooded with myriads of the small droids, rushing towards her like a swarm of hornets. Might have spoken too soon. The volley of lightning provided an opening that allowed her to retreat to a larger room, providing more space to evade the barrage of tiny cuts and slashes the droids favored. One of them slammed into her from behind, its talon-like implements hooking into her belt and dragging her over a desk, before she could disentangle herself. Slamming more droids into wall and picking off those left with lightning, the onslaught finally stopped. Zathras emerged largely unscathed, apart from a few minor nicks on her arms, and her blood-soaked clothes sticking to her skin. This smells worse than that sand demon slick on Tatooine. Iskra's going to have to pay for upgrading my shower to a water-based one. Sonic's not going to cut it. Void, I want to shower for days on end. Weapons that don't cauterize wounds are so dang uncivilized. Reminds me of taking a dip in that bloody pool on Corbin. Fun times. He reminisced fondly. Yeah, what a pity we don't have time for splashing around a little to see what pattern the blood will make on the wall. Force, I always thought you'd grow out of it. The Sith cautiously searched the adjacent rooms for more would-be adversaries, but when she found none, she ventured towards the other side of the facility. While it had sustained much less damage than the laboratories, the stench of decay worsened as she approached what looked like a lodging area. The doorway leading to the quarters was blown open, allowing a glimpse inside that revealed more corpses. This time, of people in lab coats who had obviously been rotting here for a rather long time. Zathras lowered her head in concentration. Reaching into the Force yielded no indications of survivors nearby, but there was indeed something a little further away, a faint pulse. She found a detainment area on the lowest level. The presumed explosion had wreaked havoc here as well. Zathras' hand slid along the distorted walls searchingly as she continued her exploration. Hello. Is anybody out there? A muffled voice came from one of the cells. You've got to be priffin' kidding me. Please, I am trapped here. She peered through a crack between two durasteel tiles and jerked back in surprise at the sight. The most startling part about this was not the sheer coincidence itself. They had first crossed paths on a chore, after all, so there was a plausible connection, but that it had taken a mousy Republic officer to make her believe in the Force having agency. Given the state of the facility and the hostility of the droids, there was no reason any sentient should still be alive, leaving her none the wiser as to what had actually happened here. The Force is a paradox. It empowers and imprisons. It destroys and unites. It binds the galaxy together and tears people apart. It has a will, but needs a commander. Star. Esmar was correct in that regard, too. The door controls were unusable, the electronics destroyed by the wall caving inwards. The overall structural deformation jammed the sliding doors, preventing them from being opened by physical force short of another explosion. A minor obstacle, then. She focused her will on the door, slowly bending the metal with the Force, until a hole appeared in the middle, just large enough to allow a human to step through. Okay, that's unexpected. The man imprisoned inside muttered as he clambered out of his cell warily, into the flickering light of the hallway. He jumped with fright when she addressed him from the side. Hello, Lieutenant. Stars. He exclaimed weakly, stumbling backwards while his eyes gradually adjusted to the brightness. Tris. How? She pulled him over a pile of debris, steadying him when he almost fell. This can't tell you how pleased, he rambled feverishly, his teeth chattering in the cold. When she saw him struggling to stay upright, she bent down a little and put his arm over her shoulder for support. You look like crap. Mitaka clung onto her, pressing his violently shivering body into hers without hesitation, desperate for warmth. He had not had much in terms of superfluous body fat before, although the uniform tended to pad out his silhouette a bit, but now the sharpness of his hip bones and ribsage was rather obvious. Feel like it too? He gave a feeble smile. Live support systems failed couple of rotations ago. He buried his face against her shoulder as he launched into a violent coughing fit. Was wondering what would get me first, hypothermia or dehydration. Have to get you out of here either way. There's a ship on the upper floor. What? No, he coughed up a fine spray of blood. Can't leave, need records. What I came here for. You're dying. It was obvious from the pitiful state she found him in. A superficial look aided by the Force only confirmed how bad it was. "You're in no condition to retrieve anything. Please," the Republic officer ground out haltingly, "could decide the war. Getting to the bottom of what had happened here was more important than his life." But then again, he did not seem like he would be able to slice anything more complex than a vending machine before checking out. Zathras clenched her jaw. "Are you familiar with the layout of this place?" Mitaka nodded faintly, eyes rolling back into his head briefly. "Point the way, then. I'll carry you." As far as she had been able to gather from his incoherent explanations, he had infiltrated the lab somehow, and managed to make a copy of the relevant data before security had caught him. The data was hidden on one of the emergency servers, a positively prescient move, considering what had happened afterwards. Now it was only a matter of retrieving it and downloading it physically, but even that proved too much for the injured man. She gave a frustrated huff as she propped Mitaka up on the chair when he had slid off for the third time in a row and knelt beside him. "Okay, so how do I do this? What exactly, pray tell?" "I can't help you with slicing when he died." "Not slicing. Healing." "Ooh, is the famed compassion of the GD getting to you?" "Save the taunts, Nox. Without his help, we came here in vain. If the lightning works, you can teach me your other skills, too. As long as you don't try to bind ghosts, fine. I am in no way an expert, though. Inflicting pain comes more naturally to me than alleviating it. Doesn't surprise me at all." With Nox's guidance, she placed her hands on the officer's chest, touching his essence, tracing the intertwined filaments of life, until she reached the source of his agony. Flames began lapping at her, the sharp throbbing pain of fine shards of glass fluttering over her skin. She knew what Mitaka's body needed, without understanding what exactly she was sensing, an instinctual perception of wrongness, rather than an actual diagnosis. The brightness of his being was distributed unevenly, dimming further by the second. Zathras approached the largest darkened spot, getting a sense of putrefaction, decay, anguish, death, hunger. The shards bore into her flesh abruptly, as if suddenly pulled towards her core by a kind of magnetism. The craving for her blood, her pain. It would not do to turn back now. She reached out and concentrated her intent on the weakly pulsating life under hands. To take away the affliction, the Force howled viciously round her, draping her in shadows. They tore at her, digging into her innards with claws of smoke, and yanked her forward at inconceivable speed, through a tunnel of screams and fire. Dragged her on until all she knew was anguish. It only stopped when her back hit the cold duracrete. The effort it took to even roll on her stomach afterwards was absurd. After what felt like several minutes, she managed to shift to a kneeling position. A wave of nausea washed over her. Eyes squeezed shut, she rocked back and forth on her knees, while struggling to subdue the pain. Had to overdo it. Nox's chastising voice fluctuated mutedly in unison with the pounding of her own heart echoing in her head, the only consistent rhythm she was able to feel at that moment. What happened? Even the concentration required to hold a mental conversation proved too much, causing her to throw up on the floor. "Congratulations, it seems you restored his health fully," Nox commented irritably. "Well, almost killing yourself. How?" she asked feebly when her stomach had stopped clenching. "Strictly speaking, the dark side cannot heal, not in the way a GD would, by applying force energy against the damaged tissue. That would only make things worse. While stopping a bleeding is just like telekinesis, just more refined, rebuilding the cells, encouraging the body to fight an infection is another matter entirely. The dark can preserve, certainly, bind the fragments of something broken together with searing strings of hatred, fill the cracks with anger. Never will it mend the fissures in a lasting manner. You have practiced something similar already to invigorate yourself or keep yourself alive through unspeakable hardships. It requires perpetually drawing on your emotions, sustaining yourself by sheer will. Then what? Healing another, there needs to be a sacrifice. Going beyond temporarily closing a wound, you need to transfer your own life energy into the patient. For light side users, their empathy makes this action consistent with the way they access the Force, allowing them to be replenished continually. For Sith, weakening oneself goes against our every instinct. We can still subject the Force to our will, but the strength to do so, much like everything else, comes from our darker passions only this time, not with the intent to destroy. If you lack experience in channeling the Force in that specific manner, it will fail, the attempted healing turning into a force drain on yourself. Her head was still spinning. "I didn't ask for a lecture." "No, but at least you won't interrupt me in the state you're in. Admittedly, I have only ever healed in battle. It's a lot easier if you have an unceasing fountain of fear and suffering of others to draw on instead of your own resources. I believe healing, much like sorcery, is an ability requiring a certain affinity for it. You couldn't have told me what to expect beforehand. Would you have done it, then? You will recover, don't worry, though how long it will take, I cannot say." Mitaka's worried face appeared above her. "Are you alright?" "I'm fine, just give me a moment to never mind." She looked up to him with a crooked smirk. "Just ignore the eyes." He gaped at the sight of her face, either wisely deciding to comply or too shocked to speak. "How do you feel?" "Apart from having just watched a seemingly never-ending sequence of rather traumatic, disjointed imagery of carnage and sorrow in my head, well, I thought I was dying. Absolutely great, better than I have in months." He took a shaky breath. "It's terrifying." "What was that?" "I healed you." "Don't ask." The drying blood itched on her skin, making her irritable. Yes, ma'am. He muttered miserably. I've downloaded the data. Do you need help getting to the ship? I set course for the nearest refueling station in neutral space. We're not going to get far otherwise. Mitaka called out from the pilot's chair. She paced back and forth behind him, meditating to regain her strength. How long is it going to take? 3 hours, unless we're delayed the solar activity around the Nazarick Nebula. It's a detour, to be sure. There are no hyperlanes to Coruscant from. We are not going to Coruscant. We aren't. Mitaka's high-pitched voice gave away his nervousness. Ultimately, we still might. That depends on your findings, though. His brows knitted in confusion. I am sorry, but it's actually classified. You know, I am in no way obliged to get you home. The airlock is right over there. You're joking, am I? Zathras shrugged indifferently. You tell me. I like you, but when I've risked my life helping you uncover some abstruse plot, about the last thing I want to hear is that's classified. Fair point. He hesitated briefly, but then self-preservation instincts won out. I really can't give you more details, but we, that is, my research team, well, not mine. You've met some of them, have been looking for an energy source with very specific properties. Shenzhen Shuijing R&D was an independent lab, rumored to be experimenting with suitable technology. We thought they were neutral until intel pointed to them preparing a shipment for the Sith. Zathras held up a hand to silence him. Wait, this doesn't make sense. Why? He cocked his head. Because I went to investigate the lab under the assumption that the smugglers I came with intended to fetch cargo for the Republic. Impossible. It's only our group, we were not scheduled to receive anything. I mean, perhaps a superior pulled some strings, but for Krennic to send me out without that piece of information. Zathras gave up her pacing and plunked down on the floor beside Mitaka, stretching out her limbs. Regardless of what went wrong on your end, the whole thing implies that both Republic and Separatists are after the same thing, or in the case of this being a setup, at least both sides know about the tech. So your project is either not as secret or as unique as you believe. So, he stuttered. Are you sure you're approaching this from the right angle? No, we both just know what the higher-ups tell us. But unless either of us is inadvertently working for the Separatists, let me tell you a secret. I can tell you're hiding something. What exactly is your job? No reason for a lowly engineering corps member to dirty their hands like this when you should be sitting in a lab crunching numbers. Well, I am quite harmless, aren't I? Mitaka asked sheepishly. Can't deny that, but at this rate you're going to end up killing 2 counselors and freak a third, regardless. Nox gave a polite cough. Oh come on, I know you enjoyed the subtle sense of danger, which you couldn't get in other ways. What? Inside joke, forget I ever said anything. I don't think it's a facade though. You'd break at the mere suggestion of torture. You're not really considering I'm really just a data analyst. Crunching numbers is what I do. The implementation of the findings my analyses happen to yield require resources, and since this is highly advanced research, we lack suitable people for the task, hence the need for a hands-on approach. You have no idea how much I am looking forward to sitting at my desk again. You're military, how can you have insufficient personnel for such tasks? Well, you need personnel with the appropriate project clearance and the expertise in a rare field which narrows down the number of suitable drastically. Now I am curious. Megalaser, ultrasonic shock waves, light-speed cannon. What is it? Zathras prodded. Must you give him ideas? He's an engineer. If there's anything he's not short on, it's ideas. Mitaka looked up in alarm. Ahem, why would you think? You're at war. Might be a technology facilitating reconstruction. Might be a shield, of course, but with the war dragging out needlessly, the only research you'd get grants for these days is some kind of superweapon. I can't talk about it, but I'm not wrong. Mitaka shrugged helplessly. Okay, now that you've brought me perilously close to committing treason, would you mind telling me who exactly you are? Not a GD, that's for sure. What gave it away? The spectacular sex. Mitaka blushed and cleared his throat awkwardly. If I'd have to pick one thing, it would be the casual cruelty. Or you're creepy, he gestured to the area around his eyes, whatever that is. I operate independently from the GD. The Sith purred. Does it bother you, given that you saved me on multiple occasions and have contributed to the Republic war effort? Not really. Besides, I don't think the GD are the heroes they're cracked up to be, anyway. Oh, why is that? She asked, intrigued. Some people practically idolize them as saviors. That's too high a burden, we can't expect them to live up to that. They are peacekeepers. I understand that, but then they have their place in peacetime, and we must do our duty during war. When people place their hope in the GD, and not the military or technology, it's bad for morale. She finished his thought. Mitaka nodded eagerly. And it causes bad decisions, makes the Republic too reliant on them. I don't have any problem with them, per se, but haven't seen any miracles from the GD generals in the war, either. You don't consider their force powers impressive feats. On the whole, nothing you couldn't replicate with technology, if you only devoted the resources to research. Get that? The GD had several opportunities to kill General Grievous. You know why they failed. Because they prioritized the rescue of one of their own over destroying him with his ship. Well, he is dead now, killed in an explosion. Mitaka smiled gingerly. My point exactly. Zathras snorted a laugh. At least they didn't take credit. Furthermore, their simulations yielded a maximum energy output of that can't be right, but the parameters are correct, and the model is a conservative one. Mitaka looked at her and gulped. 253.72 yotajoules. That would be more than sufficient to disintegrate a whole planet. Zathra sat up from her relaxed position on the floor, where she had spent the last 2 hours staring at ceiling in exhaustion, while the officer analyzed the data retrieved from the destroyed lab. And they knew how to utilize all that energy. Mitaka bit his lower lip while he considered the numbers. A week ago, the answer would have been a resounding no. Now I still don't think so. The main focus of Shui Jing's work appears to have been moderating the output of Kyber, a highly experimental field, and you don't start with a crystal of that hypothetical power. Given that lightsabers don't tend to blow up randomly, what would be so hard about containing the energy? Have you even had the chance to look into that? She interjected. We've got one in the lab. They're surprisingly hard to come by, considering how many GD are running around with them. We had two at some point, but the second one, exploded. Highly experimental field, huh? She asked with a mocking lilt. Early stages of research. Mitaka shrugged sheepishly. But those lightsaber crystals are tiny. In contrast, we are talking about monocrystals the size of a speeder or more. The larger a Kyber, the more volatile it is because they possess the peculiar property of supporting multiple spatial modes. To produce a diffraction-limited coherent beam, you need more than a simple emitter matrix to keep it in phase. Otherwise, the moment you apply external energy, due to the higher-order transverse modes, the lattice randomly starts emitting in all directions. Let me guess, and then it blows up. Zathra struggled to wrap her head around his explanation. That's correct. We tried anti-guided arrangements with resonant leaky wave coupling, and while that works to some degree, it limits the output drastically to the point that any proton-based energy source would be far superior. So, now that we have established you're attempting to build a kind of super laser, Mitaka cringed inwardly. How far you come in your research? She silenced him with a look when he opened his mouth to protest. No details required. I just need to know if it can be weaponized already to assess the threat it represents. The engineer put a hand to his face as he squeezed his eyes shut, making up his mind, before he replied with a heavy sigh, a pleading tone to his voice. Promise to sweep in with your powers before they put me against the wall when I end up being court-martialed. I'll be there. She gave him dark leer that did little to put his mind at ease. The Republic still has the death sentence, though. It got reintroduced recently in one of the wartime emergency power acts. And for something of this magnitude, most definitely. Zathra got up and put an arm around Mitaka's shoulder, bringing her lips close to his ear. Don't worry, your secrets are as safe with me as mine are with you. She purred. Understood. He whispered shakily. The applications are still very limited. We have not gone beyond the research stage yet. And even if we had, designing and actually building the infrastructure for such a weapon is a daunting task. Especially with our already straining capacities. So if the Sith gets ahead of us, they could theoretically vaporize Coruscant. The biggest issue is finding a suitable crystal, though, like the Shui Jing one. Considering that this crystal would have destroyed the whole moon and taken a chunk out of the planet nearby for good measure, it can't have been on site, can it? Zathra's views. No, I think what caused the explosion was a much smaller Kyber they conducted their experiments on. The majority of the data pertains to that one. While its maximum output is still quite destructive, it is consistent with the damage the facility sustained, especially if the explosion was successfully moderated to some degree. You were already in prison when it happened. Yeah, just my luck. Mitaka confirmed. I held on to hope that someone would free me, because the detention wing wasn't destroyed. There was a good chance some of the lab personnel survived. But the murderous droids explain it, of course. Why would they behave that way? This wiring usually doesn't cause tech droids to leave a bloodbath in their wake. I have no idea, to be honest. The younger man admitted. Perhaps the droids were sabotaged, which would shed a different light on the accident. It looks like their heuristics were tampered with. Wasn't me though, I swear. Not even accidentally. Perhaps you intended to recalibrate their friend for recognition. She insisted. I wouldn't have assumed Class I droids to even possess that kind of matrix, to be honest. Maybe their machine learning algorithms were retrained with a human template. Would explain the horrific. He retched a little, clearly perturbed by the memory of the mutilated bodies of the smuggling crew. Injuries. I really wish I hadn't seen that. The head scientist of Shui Genius was, probably a speciesist. Only employed humans, even if they were better qualified ALIE, non-humanoids. SC rubbed off on the droids, then. With no one around to tell us, we might never learn. One question remains, though. Where is the big crystal? I could try to correlate the timestamp of the simulation with their business activities. Mitaka trailed off, concentrating on the documents. They must have had access to it here, that's for certain, but only for a brief amount of time. The parameters factor in more uncertainty after this data. But why would they give it to the Sujas? They're major arms dealers. If the independent selling to the highest bidder, even if it dooms everyone kind. Is there any other? Mitaka deadpanned. She could sense Tyrannus' presence on Utapau. It bled into the force with the vigor of battle. Why was it that the GD always managed to be one step ahead of her, logistically at least? This was not the first time they had taken a completely different path from hers, but arrived at the same place. Analyzing various major battles, it had occasionally seemed as if Sidious was somehow in position to whisper directly into their ears, feed them poisonous morsels of intel information that was not exactly incorrect, but served to maneuver them into positions that gave him an advantage. Regarding incidents like the one on Belderin, and even in this case, however, Sidious stood nothing to gain from alerting the Council, thus giving them the chance to retrieve the precious Kyber, and possibly reveal his plans. Utaka weaved their ship through the blockade above the planet, greatly aided by the fact that the Separatists were distracted by what appeared to be an internal problem, judging from the scorched hangar bay of their capital ship. He had found a way to intercept decrypted messages from Republic forces, and learned that a GD investigator had been dispatched to Utapau earlier, and subsequently called for reinforcements, citing Sugi involvement. The ship touched down in a discreet location on a civilian landing pad. "I fear this is where we must part ways, Lieutenant." Upon seeing his alarm, she clarified. "Acquire another ship and return to Coruscant. Give them your report. I think you'll know exactly what to say." She placed her hands softly on his shoulders. "Remember, I trust you." Zathras took a moment to observe the confrontation from her vantage point. A GD had engaged Tyrannus in combat, her moves bearing striking similarity to Windu's strange twist on Gio. "You made a mistake coming here, Count. I am afraid it is you who has miscalculated, my dear Deepa." The familiar form of address made Zathras remember the name of the counselor. A hint of regret snuck into the sonorous voice of the elderly man. "Your sacrifice will be in vain. Even if I died by your hand, you would have lost." The GD stated coolly, launching into a flurry of chaotic strikes that forced Tyrannus to go on the defensive. A well-aimed thrust upset his perfect balance. Realizing this, Deepa Palava feinted a high strike, causing Tyrannus to give her an opening for a forceful kick to his side. He staggered, his impeccable footwork disturbed, allowing the GD to subsequently bash through his defenses and disarm him. Immediately, a barrage of lightning flashed towards her, which she caught with her blade just in time. What an exciting display. Zathras sat by way of greeting and remained at a distance, watching with her arms crossed. "You?" Palava called out without turning around, accidentally reflecting the lightning towards the ceiling, when she took a step towards her opponent. It hit the glass canopy above, its shards raining down a few meters away from them. "I came to see how you would fare against him," Zathras explained loftily while she summoned the other Sith saber buried him in the debris. Tyrannus's eyes darted between them, as realization dawned, his expression morphing from utter incredulity to unbridled rage. The GD Master struggled to hold up against the renewed vigor of the lightning. "Then help me detain him," she cried when the sheer force of the onslaught caused her to slide backwards gradually. "This is your chance to show your true allegiance." Palava's back hit the wall, the hateful electricity spread out from her quivering saber, threatening to engulf her. In a last-ditch attempt, she ducked out to the side under the blade and threw out her hand. The invisible shove caught Tyrannus off guard and sent him tumbling. Another flick of the GD's hand caused his face to hit the floor with a resounding crack. He quickly pushed himself to all fours again, looking up with burning orange eyes from his pitiful position. The blood trickling from his nose got soaked up by his beard, creating a savage look that contrasted with his noble bearing. Indeed, Zathras's eyes locked with the darts, disgusted by the unbecoming fear she saw in them. "You have not yet defeated me, Deepa." Tyrannus growled without breaking eye contact with the other Sith. "Oh, don't stop on my behalf." She gave a hollow laugh before addressing the Master. "He is right, Master Palava. Be careful." Palava approached her crouching opponent with extreme vigilance, masking her exhaustion with an air of authority. Zathras held up a hand, stopping the GD in her tracks, and gently pushed her backwards. "What do you want?" The Chalacta Master grinned out warily, her composure serene despite her growing impatience. "I could kill him for you, as proof of my alliance with the GD." Zathras whispered coyly in reply, igniting Dooku's saber, and pointing it towards his head. Palava promptly took another step back to stay clear of the combat about to ensue. Although her chagrined expression made it obvious that she would have preferred to bring in the Separatist leader alive, she did not dare get in the way at this point. A dark husky element slipped into Zathras's voice. "However, I will have far more options if I simply execute you." She flipped the saber round into an underhand grip and drove it into Palava's abdomen. "Alas, you underestimated the dynamics of treachery among the Sith," she commented, switching off the red blade when the GD's body went slack and sank to the floor. Zathras picked up the Palava's saber and stepped over her prone form without sparing her another look. "So, Tyrannus," she purred, twirling both sabers idly. "How do you wish to die, in combat or on your knees?" Darth Tyrannus had risen to a standing position and dusted off his robes, glaring at her in silent defiance. "Combat it is, then," he nodded, still too calm for a man about to die. "I shall grant you the opportunity to listen." In that case, a vicious smile split her face when she tossed Tyrannus' saber. "Keep it brief. I am afraid you won't last long against me, old man. Judging from your unwarranted hostility, I can only assume you believe I turned on you." Smart. There was no holocry. And your minions shot me down over the planet you sent me to. Deku effortlessly parried her first strikes, defending rather than actively attempting to create and exploit openings for a counterattack. Then we both sprung the trap laid by my master. He must have intended to goad me, test me. The information that led me to determine the location of the holocron came through neutral channels, so it would not arouse suspicion. The GD Shadow had access to the same sources. They are well connected, and finding dark artifacts is what they do. He fell for the ruse as well. Sidious played us all. You're lying. Zathras snapped, her voice betraying more disappointment than she intended. The Shadow's involvement couldn't have been an accident, when the whole point was to lure his peers to Beldarin, where you killed Grievous. He was an important asset. A neutral one, his loyalty easy to sway, his only motivation the desire to eradicate the GD. Such a wasteful approach. Cold rage washing over him, Tyrannus lunged forward, thrusting his blade towards her hip. He followed your command. How could this have been a test for you? Zathras retaliated for the near miss by pressing the attack, forcing her opponent backwards until he stumbled and fell. Surprisingly nimble for his old age, Tyrannus rolled to the side, evading her wide slashing strike, and jumped to his feet, putting enough distance between them to briefly stall the fight. An unfortunate convergence of two disparate threads. You see, this plan had indeed been long in the making. With the Shadow's inadvertent involvement, we were in the perfect position to execute it. I could not refuse to carry it out. It was only after you left that Sidious informed me of the proceedings, and that more GD had started investigating the matter, forcing me to send a ship. For obvious reasons, I could not order them not to shoot you. Nevertheless, you were not supposed to cross my operations, either. We had an agreement. Zathras shifted into a ready stance again, but remained where she stood. I made the rather natural assumption that you betrayed me. It is still more plausible that you are simply seeking to manipulate me. Then Sidious has already triumphed, having managed to thwart our tentative alliance even without knowing. Zathras laughed harshly. You expect me to believe that he isn't aware of me? An unrelenting invisible grip wrapped around her opponent's throat. I have not told him. Tyrannus croaked, fighting the pressure that threatened to cut off his breathing. I could not allow even suggestion of dissent. He already suspects previous acolytes I trained threat to him could be apprentices. Although she did not trust the older Sith, his explanation made more sense than him just randomly changing his mind after striking a promising alliance. You expect me to just take your word for it? A bright yellow flash lit up in the atmosphere above them, rippling out to the sides. The capital ship in orbit exploded, the resulting magnetic shockwaves cleanly taking out the other vessels surrounding it. The sky was suddenly inundated with flames and falling wreckage. Zathras marveled at the display. Looks like you lost on another front as W. A searing pain shot across her lower back, making her release the pressure on her opponent's airways. Crimson rage coloring her field of vision, she spun around to see Palava looking up with her hand outstretched, tear-streaked face shining with resolve. A large bloody shard clattered to the floor. The lightsaber nearly slipped from her grasp when she felt a tendril of the Force insistently tugging on it. Tyrannus suddenly appeared beside the two women, swinging his saber in his small arm. Zathras brought her weapon up to block, but the angle was wrong. The red blade swiftly cut through bone, cartilage and flesh, beheading the GD. Tyrannus jumped backwards and thumbed off his weapon. I admit that I have no proof. He snarled. However, I hope you two are not foolish enough to ignore the fact that in your moment of abject weakness, I could have easily given you the same death Master Palava has received. Zathras' fingers ghosted over the deep wound stretching across her hip, blood covering them in a steady stream that lessened as she willed the wound to close to some extent to stop the hemorrhaging, stitched together by raw fury, fueled by the pain and humiliation. It appears I misread your intentions. She grudgingly admitted, lips pressed into a fine line. Your overconfidence has made you careless. Tyrannus chided her. Zathras sneered, says the man who just lost his battlecruiser. He seemed rather unfazed. A minor, anticipated setback. A far larger blow to the Republic has been dealt, and if everything went according to plan, to the GD and Sidious alike. Thankfully, this time your intervention was not to blame. She wiped her sticky hand on her trousers. Will you finally reveal his identity to me now? Regrettably, this is one dead piece I must cling to. However, there is something else I can offer you. A gift to show you my willingness to work together beyond my master's defeat. What do you think I could possibly want? Zathras snorted in disbelief. Something I believe you have sought for a long time. Tyrannus held her gaze, brows arching haughtily. Nox, who had remained unusually silent throughout the whole exchange, failed to offer his advice here, as well. There was a long pause before she nodded her acceptance. Very well. This had better not be another trap. Return to your ship at your leisure. I shall send you the data. The elderly man's voice rang through the cockpit. As promised, the coordinates have been uploaded to your navicomputer. I would recommend you to hurry, however. It seems the Republic has been made aware of the facility I directed you to as well. What did I say about sending me into another mess? Zathras sighed. Now, I did not imply it would come without a challenge. This is the last time I will allow such insolence. She spat with outrage. You will pay for your arrogance, Deku. You clearly have become too complacent in your position, with no one daring to challenge your authority, and, perhaps, The Darth hummed. Such is the way of the Sith. I am confident, however, that you possess the foresight and restraint to refrain from propagating the culture of backstabbing. That surely was to blame for the fall of the Empire, you Sir Darth. Zathras vented her frustration on the holoprojector. The entrance slid open as soon as she punched in the last digit of the access code. It was a comparatively small station, in total perhaps thrice the size of the hangar of a Hera-class dreadnought. The few droids maintaining it scurried out of her way as she cautiously explored the rooms to find out what Tyrannus had in store for her. Empty. At first glance, the place was devoid of life and anything useful. It was impossible to determine what could have been the purpose of the station in the first place. Doubling back to continue her search, she found herself in a small med bay which she had ignored earlier. Her wondering gaze fell on the 3 upright slabs of carbonite standing in a corner beside a bacta tank. A boundless chasm of absolute wrath opened in her chest. Dang you, Nox. I can explain. No, you won't get to spoon-feed me more falsehoods. You told me they were dead. All this time, you must have at least suspected that Tyrannus had them. I didn't want you to assume he had leverage against you. It would have altered your course of action. When he didn't bring up the topic during your meeting, I sincerely thought they had not survived the stasis, which was pretty likely since they're not even force sensitive. And when we thought he betrayed us, the point was moot anyway. I did not give you permission to speak, Roshan. You wretched. Come on now, that is low. Worthless scum. If you had told me of the possibility, I could have done something. Exactly, I thought I knew you better than that. What about Theron? Would you not have set worlds ablaze to get him back? That I would have, after it became clear that getting the 4 of you out of stasis was not a trivial task. However, I had 50 years to come to terms with the fact that he was gone. I was not going to sacrifice the opportunity of rising to power again on the off chance my one-time lover survived impossible odds. And by lying to me, you took agency away from me. You betrayed my trust. Zathras, I do admit it was a mistake to keep you in the dark. Your last bloody mistake. Sirens started blaring overhead. Phew, execution postponed I guess. Nox commented, mostly unperturbed. Hands trembling with barely suppressed rage, Zathras snatched a medkit from the supply closet next to the door, and deactivated the freezing mode on all 3 carbonite frames. There's no hibernation sickness, she pleaded inwardly. Pierce dropped out first, followed by the other 2 men. They were naked except for briefs, as if they had been frozen coming straight from a back-to-tank treatment. She felt for his pulse. It was abnormally slow but strong. From what she could see, Quinn and Theron appeared to be in no danger of dying, either. She opened the medkit and fished out a hypo-stim and a back-to injector. As much as she hated to risk it, Pierce was physically more robust than the others were. He probably could take it. Theron was the youngest by a few years, but the side of his face looked rather bad, with cauterized skin around his implants, which had turned into shriveled pieces of scorched metal. She injected the contents of the stim into Pierce's thigh. While she waited, she brushed her hands over his abdomen and chest, feeling for inner injuries. Although she had accepted having little aptitude for healing and not knowing what else awaited them there, she was loath to repeat the idiot-iced version performed on Mitaka. She could at least make it easier for him by boosting his natural resilience. There was no shortage of fury to fuel her powers, either. HNGH. Her patience was rewarded with a muffled groan. Zathras gently tilted the man's head up. His eyes were unfocused, rolling back into his skull repeatedly before they settled on her face. Hey, Lord, came his shaky whisper. She slowly helped him up to a standing position, his eyes darting around the room in confusion. Can you walk? She demanded. Pierce took a few tentative steps. Yeah, best keep the pace slow though. I'll take Quinn. Are you able to carry Shan? Pierce cracked his shoulders and nodded, giving Theron a condescending look. She draped the limp form of the agent over the Imperial's broad back. Figured you'd be even less happy the other way around. Zathras teased. He stumbled a little, almost dropping Theron, but caught his balance again without help. Dang right, she pulled Quinn up to carry him herself. Now move it, Pierce. These sirens probably aren't just malfunctioning. As they reached the hallway leading to the hangar, there was movement before them. They sought cover in a secondary corridor. Theron let out a faint grunt when his back touched the cold metal, causing Zathras to place a hand over his mouth to muffle the noise. The distinctive sound of armored boots rang in the distance. With Pierce far from fighting shape and the other 2 still out cold, she could not risk an altercation, even though she would very much have preferred to keep a low profile this time. Listen. She climbed over Theron's body and knelt down next to Pierce, hand-fisted into the short hair on the back of his neck to keep his attention on her. I need you to follow my lead, unquestioningly. No sass, no bravado. Best no talking at all. Understood. Ever disappointed you? No, but circumstances are a bit bizarre at the moment. Since when does Normie win a bloody prize? Pierce slurred. But noted, Lord. No titles either. She stressed. Thought his head slumped on her shoulder. Just, get a grip, Pierce. She sighed and propped him up again before ducking out of cover. She carefully made her way towards source of the noise. Hello? The marching troops abruptly changed direction, if the sound getting louder was any indication. I need help. Bile rose in her throat for admitting weakness, even though it was a facade. She stood in the middle of the hallway, completely exposed, and raised her arms above her head in surrender. A torchlight shone into her face. After a moment of stunned silence, one of the soldiers exclaimed, "It's her, her." A murmur went through the unit of clone troopers. The heroine of the forward sanctuary X. What a clunky title. Zathras affected what she hoped was a relieved smile. Echo stepped up. "Ah, what are you doing here, man? I came to rescue my friends from the clutches of the separatists. Please, you must help me get them out off here." She suspected her plea sounded a little too shrill, but then again, she had never needed to beg like that. They lowered their rifles with little reluctance. Well, having a good reputation pays off at last. Aboard the Republic ship, the medic scanned the still form of her companions. Without looking up from his patient, he inquired, "Carbonite?" "Yes," Zathras acknowledged. "How can you tell?" "Typical slowing of life signs. Must have been frozen for several weeks at the very least." The clone stepped away from the bedside to give his report. "Well, these two are stable. However, the younger one's cybernetics don't look good at all. Need to check for brain damage. The arm on the other one not sure even the socket is salvageable. We should take you to Camino, closest advanced healthcare facilities." He gestured towards the implants. "No guarantees though. Never seen those before. Why are they still unconscious? They were sedated before freezing. Takes a while to wear off because of the decelerated metabolism. Up the dose so they stay under until we reach our destination. In the future, don't do that without my consent." Zathras reprimanded him. "With all due respect, ma'am, as their medic I am responsible for such decisions, and as their commanding officer, I bear the ultimate responsibility for their lives." The clone gave her a thoroughly confused look, but seemed to accept her explanation regardless. She inclined her head towards Pierce expectantly, who sat slouched over on a bed, fidgeting with his legs, eyes narrowed in dismay as he watched the exchange. "He's in good condition, although his heart rate is on the high side. Looks like a stim overdose," the clone explained. "How much did you give him?" She gestured to a similar vial in the medic's arsenal. "The whole thing." He blanched a little. "Yeah, that's not for direct injection though. We normally add it to the Bacta when required. It's compatible with the Hypo 1C syringe. You just have to adjust the dosing algorithm." He held up the injector. "For his mass, a third of that amount would have sufficed." Zathras furrowed her brows, steeling herself against a flicker of guilt. Is he going to be okay? Luckily, the medkits only carry the least potent variant. Taking this much is more like drinking a lot of caf. The clone shrugged apologetically. "A whole pitcher of strong caf, to be honest. Expect headaches and trouble sleeping for at least 48 hours. He's probably going to be pretty keyed up for a while. I could give him a tranquilizer to counter the effects, but I'd advise against it, as that would put even more strain on his heart. You can toughen it out." She addressed Pierce questioningly. "Sure." He grunted in a low voice, making his aversion to talking in the clone's presence clear. It was not long after that Pierce joined her in an adjacent room where the Kaminoans had told her to wait. Zathras gave him an inquiring look. One of the longnecks took them elsewhere. No point sitting in the med bay alone. She beckoned him to sit beside her on the elongated settee. "Sorry about the stim. I was in a hurry. Had worse. Push comes to mind." They shared a meaningful smirk. "Once Theron and Quinn are done with their treatment, you can all recover in an environment with more privacy." She knew Pierce well enough to see that he was biting back a question. "Out with it, right? So any reason we're friendly with the pups now?" "Doesn't look like an into. Wish it were one." She clenched her jaw. "You're not going to like this. Can handle it." Pierce huffed in response. "I know. What's the last thing you remember?" His brows furrowed in concentration as tried to make sense of the jumbled memories. "I can't. Thrown them. You screaming." She looked away from his face as she summed up the events. "Long story short, the weapon didn't raise the planet, but that throne put us into stasis." His eyes widened in shock. "For how long?" "Almost 4 times the length of Vitiate's ring." Bloody void. He groaned after a brief mental calculation. "It's just the Republic now," she added bluntly. The officer jumped up from the bench, his clenched fist shaking in anger, and yelled, "We freaking lost." That about sums it up. Yes. Face going slack in defeated acceptance, he slumped back down. "Never been an ordinary post with you, got to say." He squeezed his eyes shut in pain and started rubbing his temples. "Let me," Zathras commanded softly while she casually slid off the settee. When she stood behind him, he leaned back, until the back of his head came to rest on her stomach and relaxed into the caress of her hands. "Strange times," Pierce murmured. "Didn't think I'd ever see your eyes in another color. Looks good too. Bit plain though, all things considered." "Well, now you've literally seen all facets of me." She chuckled. "Wouldn't mind getting a reminder of some." "There's an appropriate time and place for everything, Pierce." She reprimanded him, the harsh tone contrasting with the indulgent smile she gave the Imperial. "Noted. Wasn't suggesting here, with those bucketheads next door. What did you do to get all puppy-eyed about you?" "Saved one of their medical frigates. It wasn't my primary goal, but it unarguably worked in my favor, as evidenced by the warm welcome we got here." He hissed when Zathras touched a particularly sensitive spot. "That's all going to take some time getting used to. It wasn't easy for me, either. I'll fill you in on the details later, away from prying ears. We're officially rolling with the pups now, for the time being, yes." Her lips brushed the shell of his ear. Maybe it helps if you think of it as a prolonged covert operation. Of all sudden, a commotion ensued outside. Speaking of which, Tyrannus interrupted the massage with an annoyed sigh and walked towards the door. Pierce followed on her heel.